Section 1 of The Golden Bough, Part 4, Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Volume 2, by Sir James George Frazer. Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Studies in the History of Oriental Religion by J. G. Frazer, DCL, LLD, Doctorate of Literature, Fellow Trinity College, Cambridge, Professor of Social Anthropology in the University of Liverpool. Third edition revised and enlarged in 2 volumes. Volume 2. Book 3rd. Osiris. Chapter 1. The Myth of Osiris. Osiris, the Egyptian counterpart of Adonis and Attis. In ancient Egypt, the god whose death and resurrection were annually celebrated with alternate sorrow and joy was Osiris, the most popular of all Egyptian deities, and there are good grounds for classing him in one of his aspects with Adonis and Attis as a personification of the great yearly vicissitudes of nature, especially of the corn. But the immense vogue which he enjoyed for many ages induced his devoted worshippers to heap upon him the attributes and powers of many other gods, so that it is not always easy to strip him, so to say, of his borrowed plumes and restore them to their proper owners. In the following pages, I do not pretend to enumerate and analyze all the alien elements which thus gathered round the popular deity. All that I shall attempt to do is to peel off these accretions and to exhibit the god so far as possible in his primitive simplicity. The discoveries of recent years in Egypt enabled us to do so with more confidence now than when I first addressed myself to the problem many years ago. The Myth of Osiris. The story of Osiris is told in a connected form only by Plutarch, whose narrative has been confirmed and, to some extent, amplified in modern times by the evidence of the monuments. The Pyramid Texts. Of the monuments which illustrate the myth or legend of Osiris, the oldest are a long series of hymns, prayers, incantations, and liturgies which have been found engraved in hieroglyphics on the walls, passages, and galleries of 5 pyramids at Saqqara. From the places where they were discovered, these ancient religious records are known as the Pyramid Texts. They date from the 5th and 6th dynasties, and the periods of time which they were carved on the pyramids is believed to have been roughly 150 years, from about the year 2625 BC onward, but from their contents it appears that many of these documents were drawn up much earlier, for in some of them there are references to works which have perished, and in others there are political allusions which seem to show that the passages containing them must have been composed at a time when the northern and southern kingdoms were still independent and hostile states and had not yet coalesced into a single realm under the sway of one powerful monarch. As the union of the kingdoms appears to have taken place about 3,400 years before our era, the whole period covered by the composition of the pyramid texts probably did not fall short of 1,000 years. Thus the documents from the oldest body of religious literature surviving to us from the ancient world and occupy a place in the history of Egyptian language and civilization, like that which the Vedic hymns and incantations occupy in the history of Aryan speech and culture. The pyramid texts intended to ensure the blissful immortality of Egyptian kings. The special purpose for which these texts were engraved on the pyramids was to ensure the eternal life and felicity of the dead kings who slept beneath these colossal monuments. Hence the dominant note that sounds through them all is an insistent, a passionate protest against the reality of death. Indeed, the word death never occurs in the pyramid texts, except to be scornfully denied or to be applied to an enemy. Again and again, the indomitable assurance is repeated that the dead man did not die but lives. King Teddy has not died a death, he has become a glorious one in the horizon. Ho, King Unis, thou didst not depart dead, thou didst depart living. Thou hast departed that thou mightest live, thou hast not departed that thou mightest die. Thou diest not, this King Pepe dies not. Have ye said that he would die? He dies not, this King Pepe lives forever. Live, thou shalt not die. Thou livest, raise thee up. Thou diest not, stand up, raise thee up. O lofty one among the imperishable stars, thou perished not eternally. Thus for Egyptian kings death was swallowed up in victory, and through their tears Egyptian mourners might ask, like Christian mourners thousands of years afterwards, "O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?" The story of Osiris in the pyramid texts. Now it is significant that in these ancient documents, though the myth or legend of Osiris is not set forth at length, it is often alluded to as if it were a matter of common knowledge. Hence we may legitimately infer the great antiquity of the Osirian tradition in Egypt. Indeed, so numerous are the allusions to it in the pyramid texts that by their help we could reconstruct the story in its main outlines, even without the narrative of Plutarch. Thus the discovery of these texts has confirmed our belief in the accuracy and fidelity of the Greek writer, and we may accept his account with confidence even when it records incidents or details which have not yet been verified by comparison with original Egyptian sources. The tragic tale runs thus. Osiris, the son of the earth god and the sky goddess. Osiris was the offspring of an intrigue between the earth god Seb, Keb or Geb, as the name is sometimes transliterated, and the sky goddess Nut. The Greeks identified his parents with their own deities Cronus and Rhea. When the sun god Ra perceived that his wife Nut had been unfaithful to him, he declared with a curse that she should be delivered of the child in no month and no year. But the goddess had another lover, the god Thoth, or Hermes, as the Greeks called him, and he playing at draughts with the moon won from her a 72nd part of every day, and having compounded 5 whole days out of these parts, he added them to the Egyptian year of 360 days. This was a mythical origin of the 5 supplementary days which the Egyptians annually inserted at the end of every year in order to establish a harmony between lunar and solar time. On these 5 days, regarded as outside the year of 12 months, the cursed the sun god did not rest, and accordingly Osiris was born on the first of them. At his nativity a voice rang out proclaiming that the Lord of all had come into the world. Some say that a certain Pamales heard a voice from the temple at Thebes, bidding him announce with a shout that a great king, the beneficent Osiris, was born. But Osiris is not the only child of his mother. On the 2nd of the supplementary days she gave birth to the elder Horus. On the 3rd to the god Set, whom the Greeks called Typhon, on the 4th to the goddess Isis, and on the 5th to the goddess Nephthys. Afterwards Set married his sister Nephthys, and Osiris married his sister Isis. Isis introduces the cultivation of corn and of the vine. Reigning as a king on earth, Osiris reclaimed the Egyptians from savagery, gave them laws, and taught them to worship the gods. Before his time, the Egyptians had been cannibals, but Isis, the sister and wife of Osiris, discovered wheat and barley growing wild, and Osiris introduced the cultivation of these grains among his people, who forthwith abandoned cannibalism and took kindly to a corn diet. Moreover, Osiris is said to have been the first to gather fruit from trees, to train the vine to poles, and to tread the grapes. Eager to communicate these beneficial discoveries to all mankind, he committed the whole government of Egypt to his wife Isis, and travelled over the world, diffusing the blessings of civilization and agriculture wherever he went. In countries where a harsh climate or niggardly soil forbade the cultivation of the vine, he taught the inhabitants to console themselves for the want of wine by brewing beer from barley. Loaded with the wealth that had been showered upon him by grateful nations, he returned to Egypt, and on account of the benefits he had conferred on mankind, he was unanimously hailed and worshipped as a deity. But his brother Set, whom the Greeks called Typhon, with 72 others, plotted against him. His violent death. Having taken the measure of his good brother's body by stealth, the bad brother Typhon fashioned and highly decorated a coffer of the same size, and once when they were all drinking and making merry, he brought in the coffer and jestingly promised to give it to the one whom it should fit exactly. Well, they all tried one after the other, but it fitted none of them. Last of all, Osiris stepped into it and lay down. On that the conspirators ran and slammed the lid down on him, nailed it fast, soldered it with molten lead, and flung the coffer into the Nile. This happened on the 17th day of the month Aether, when the sun is in the sign of the Scorpion, and the 28th year of the reign or the life of Osiris. Isis searches for his body. When Isis heard of it, she sheared off a lock of her hair, put on mourning attire, and wandered disconsolately up and down seeking the body. She takes refuge in the papyrus swamps. By the advice of the god of wisdom, she took refuge in the papyrus swamps of the delta. 7 scorpions accompanied her in her flight. One evening when she was weary, she came to the house of a woman, who, alarmed at the sight of the scorpions, shut the door in her face. Then one of the scorpions crept under the door and stung the child of the woman that he died. But when Isis heard the mother's lamentation, her heart was touched, and she laid her hands on the child and uttered her powerful spells. So the poison was driven out of the child, and he lived. Isis and her infant son Horus. Afterwards, Isis herself gave birth to a son in the swamps. She had conceived him while she fluttered in the form of a hawk over the corpse of her dead husband. The infant was the younger Horus, who in his youth bore the name of Harpocrates, that is, the child Horus. Him, Bough, the goddess of the north, hid from the wrath of his wicked uncle Set, yet she could not guard him from all mishap. For one day when Isis came to her little son's hiding place, she found him stretched lifeless and rigid on the ground. A scorpion had stung him. Then Isis prayed to the sun god Ra for help. The god hearkened to her and stayed his bark in the sky, and sent down Thoth to teach her the spell by which she might restore her son to life. She uttered the words of power, and straightway the poison flowed from the body of Horus. Air passed into him, and he lived. Then Thoth ascended up into the sky, and took his place once more in the bark of the sun, and the bright pomp passed onward jubilant. The body of Osiris floats to Byblos, where it is recovered by Isis. Meantime, the coffer containing the body of Osiris had floated down the river and away out to sea, till at last it drifted ashore at Byblos on the coast of Syria. Here a fine erica tree shot up suddenly and enclosed the chest in its trunk. The king of the country, admiring the growth of the tree, had it cut down and made into a pillar of his house, but he did not know that the coffer with the dead Osiris was in it. Word of this came to Isis, and she journeyed to Byblos, and sat down by the well in humble guise, her face wet with tears. To none would she speak till the king's handmaidens came, and then she greeted kindly, and braided their hair, and breathed on them from her own divine body a wondrous perfume. But when the queen beheld the braids of her handmaiden's hair, and smelt the sweet smell that emanated from them, she sent for the stranger woman, and took her into her house, and made her the nurse of her child. But Isis gave the babe her finger instead of her breast to suck, and at night she began to burn all that was mortal of him away, while she herself, in the likeness of a swallow, fluttered round the pillar that contained her dead brother, twittering mournfully. But the queen spied what she was doing, and shrieked out when she saw her child in flames, and thereby she hindered him from becoming immortal. Then the goddess revealed herself and begged for the pillar of the roof, and they gave it her, and she cut the coffer out of it, and fell upon it, and embraced it, and lamented so loud that the younger of the king's children died of fright on the spot. But the trunk of the tree she wrapped in fine linen, and poured ointment on it, and gave it to the king and queen. And the wood stands in the temple of Isis, and is worshipped by the people of Byblos to this day. And Isis put the coffer in a boat, and took the eldest of the king's children with her, and sailed away. As soon as they were alone, she opened the chest, and laying her face on the face of her brother, she kissed him and wept. But the child came behind her softly, and saw what she was about, and she turned and looked at him in anger, and the child could not bear her look, and died. But some say that it was not so, but that he fell into the sea and was drowned. It is he whom the Egyptians sing of at their banquets under the name of Maneros. The body of Isis dismembered by Typhon, and the pieces recovered by Isis. But Isis put the coffer by, and went to see her son Horus at the city of Bough, And Typhon found the coffer as he was hunting a boar one night by the light of a full moon, and he knew the body and rent it into 14 pieces and scattered them abroad. But Isis sailed up and down the marshes in a shallop made of papyrus, looking for the pieces, and that is why when people sail in shallops made of papyrus, the crocodiles do not hurt them, for they fear or respect the goddess. And that is the reason too why there are so many graves of Osiris in Egypt, for she buried each limb as she found it. But others will have it that she buried an image of him in every city, pretending it was his body in order that Osiris might be worshipped in many places, and that if Typhon searched for the real grave, he might not be able to find it. However, the genital member of Osiris had been eaten by the fishes, so Isis made an image of it instead, and the image is used by the Egyptians at their festivals to this day. Diodorus Siculus on the burial of Osiris. Isis, writes the historian Diodorus Siculus, recovered all the parts of the body except the genitals, and because she wished that her husband's grave should be unknown and honoured by all who dwell in the land of Egypt, she resorted to the following device. She moulded human images out of wax and spices, corresponding to the statue of Osiris on each one of the parts of his body. Then she called in the priests according to their families and took an oath of them, or they would reveal to no man the trust she was about to repose in them. So to each of them privately she said that to them alone she entrusted the burial of the body, and reminding them of the benefits they had received, she exhorted them to bury the body in her own land and to honour Osiris as a god. She also besought them to dedicate one of the animals of their country, whichever they choose, and to honour it in life as they had formerly honoured Osiris, and when it died to grant it obsequies like his. And because she would encourage the priests in her own interest to bestow the aforesaid honours, she gave them a third part of the land to be used by them in the service and worship of the gods. Accordingly, it is said that the priests, mindful of the benefits of Osiris, desirous of gratifying the queen and moved by the prospect of gain, carried out all the injunctions of Osiris. Wherefore to this day each of the priests imagines that Osiris is buried in his country, and they honour the beasts that they consecrated in the beginning. When the animals die, the priests renew at their burial the mourning for Osiris. But the sacred bulls, the one called Attis and the other Minervis, were dedicated to Osiris, and it was ordained that they should be worshipped as gods in common by all the Egyptians, since these animals above all others had helped the discoverers of corn in sowing the seed and procuring the universal benefit of agriculture. The various members of Osiris treasured as relics in various parts of Egypt. Such is the myth or legend of Osiris as told by Greek writers, and eked out by more or less fragmentary notices or allusions in native Egyptian literature. A long inscription in the temple of Dendera has preserved a list of the god's graves, and other texts mention the part of his body which were treasured as holy relics in each of the sanctuaries. Thus his heart was at Athribis, his backbone at Busiris, his neck at Lectopolis, and his head at Memphis. As often happens in such cases, some of his divine limbs were miraculously multiplied. His head, for example, was at Abydos as well as at Memphis, and his legs, which were remarkably numerous, would have sufficed for several ordinary mortals. In this respect, however, Osiris was nothing to St. Denis, of whom no less than 7 heads, all equally genuine, are extant. Osiris mourned by Isis and Nephthys. According to native Egyptian accounts, which supplement that of Plutarch, when Isis had found the corpse of her husband Osiris, she and her sister Nephthys sat down beside it and uttered a lament, which in after ages became the type of all Egyptian lamentations for the dead. "Come to thy house," they wailed, "come to thy house. O God On, come to thy house, thou who hast no foes. O fair youth, come to thy house, that thou mayest see me. I am thy sister, whom thou lovest. Thou shalt not part from me. O fair boy, come to thy house. I see thee, not yet doth my heart yearn after thee, and mine eyes desire thee. Come to her who loves thee, one of her, thou blessed one. Come to thy sister, come to thy wife thou whose hearts stand still. Come to thy housewife. I am thy sister by the same mother. Thou shalt not be far from me. Gods and men have turned their faces towards thee, and weep with thee together. I call after thee and weep, so that my cry is heard to heaven, but thou hearest not my voice, yet I am thy sister, whom thou didst love on earth. Thou didst love but me, my brother, my brother. This lament for the fair youth cut off in his prime reminds us of the laments for Adonis. The title of Anifer, or the good being, bestowed on him, marks the beneficence which tradition universally ascribed to Osiris. It was at once his commonest title and one of his names as king. Being brought to life again, Osiris reigns as king and judge of the dead in the other world. The lamentations of the two sad sisters were not in vain. In pity for her sorrow, the sun god Bough sent down from heaven the jackal-headed god Anubis, who, with the aid of Isis and Attis, of Thoth and Horus, pieced together the broken body of the murdered god, swathed it in linen bandages, and observed all the other rites which the Egyptians were wont to perform over the bodies of the departed. Then Isis fanned the cold clay with her wings. Osiris revived, and thenceforth reigned as king of the dead in the other world. There he bore the titles of Lord of the Underworld, Lord of Eternity, Ruler of the Dead. There too in the great hall of the two truths, assisted by 42 assessors, one from each of the principal districts of Egypt, he presided as judge at the trial of the souls of the departed, who made their solemn confession before him, and their heart have been weighed in the balance of justice, received their reward of virtue in a life eternal, or the appropriate punishment of their sins. The Confession of the Dead. The confession, or rather profession, which the Book of the Dead puts in the mouth of the deceased at the judgment bar of Osiris, sets the morality of the ancient Egyptians in a very favourable light. In rendering an account of his life, the deceased solemnly protested that he had not oppressed his fellow men, that he had made none to weep, that he had done no murder, neither committed fornication nor borne false witness, that he had not falsified the balance, that he had not taken the milk from the mouths of babes, that he had not given bread to the hungry and water to the thirsty, and had clothed the naked. In harmony with these professions are the epitaphs on Egyptian graves, which reveal, if not the moral practice, at least the moral ideals of those who slept beneath them. Thus, for example, a man says in his epitaph, "I gave bread to the hungry and clothes to the naked, and ferried across in my own boat him who could not pass the water. I was a father to the orphan, a husband to the widow, a shelter from the wind to them that were cold. I am one that spake good and told good. I earned my substance in righteousness." Those who had done this in their mortal life and had been acquitted at the great disease were believed to dwell thenceforth at ease in a land where the corn grew higher than on earth, where harvests never failed, where trees were always green, and wives ever young and fair. The fate of the wicked. We are not clearly informed as to the fate which the Egyptians supposed to befall the wicked after death. In the scenes which represent the Last Judgment, there is seen crouching beside the scales, in which the heart of the dead is being weighed, a monstrous animal known as the Eater of the Dead. It has the head of a crocodile, the trunk of a lion, and the hinder parts of a hippopotamus. Some think that the souls of those whose hearts had been weighed in the balance and found wanting were delivered over to this grim monster to be devoured, but this view appears to be conjectural. Generally, the animal seems to have been placed there simply as guardian of the entrance to the fields of the blessed, but sometimes it is likened to Set. Elsewhere, it is said that the judges of the dead slay the wicked and drink their blood. In brief, here also we have conflicting statements, and can only gather that there seems to be no general agreement among the dwellers in the valley of the Nile as to the ultimate lot of the wicked. In the resurrection of Osiris, the Egyptians saw a pledge of their own immortality. In the resurrection of Osiris, the Egyptians saw the pledge of a life everlasting for themselves beyond the grave. They believed that every man would live eternally in the other world, if only his surviving friends did for his body what the gods had done for the body of Osiris. Hence the ceremonies observed by the Egyptians over the human dead were an exact copy of those which Anubis, Horus, and the rest had performed over the dead god. At every burial there was enacted a representation of the divine mystery which had been performed of old over Osiris, when his son, his sisters, his friends were gathered round his mangled remains and succeeded by their spells and manipulations in converting his broken body into the first mummy, which they afterwards reanimated and furnished with the means of entering on a new individual life beyond the grave. The mummy of the deceased was Osiris. The professional female mourners were his two sisters, Isis and Nephthys. Anubis, Horus, all the gods of the Assyrian legend gathered about the corpse. In the solemn drama of death and resurrection, the principal part was played by the celebrant, who represented Horus, the son of the dead, and resuscitated Osiris. He formally opened the eyes and mouth of the dead man by rubbing or pretending to rub them 4 times with the bleeding heart and thigh of a sacrificed bull, at which a pretense was made of actually opening the mouth of the mummy or of the statue with certain instruments specially reserved for the purpose. Geese and gazelles were also sacrificed by being decapitated. They were supposed to represent the enemies of Osiris, who after the murder of the divine man had sought to evade the righteous punishment of their crime, but had been detected and beheaded. Every dead Egyptian identified with Osiris. Thus, every dead Egyptian was identified with Osiris and bore his name. From the Middle Kingdom onwards, it was the regular practice to address the deceased as Osiris so-and-so, as if he were the god himself, and to add the standing epithet true of speech, because true speech was characteristic of Osiris. The thousands of inscribed and pictured tombs that have been opened in the valley of the Nile prove that the mystery of the resurrection was performed for the benefit of every dead Egyptian. As Osiris died and rose again from the dead, so all men hope to arise like him from death to life eternal. In an Egyptian text it is said of the departed that, as surely as Osiris lives, so shall he live also. As surely as Osiris did not die, so shall he not die. As surely as Osiris is not annihilated, so shall he too not be annihilated. The dead man, conceived to be lying, like Osiris, with mangled body, was comforted by being told that the heavenly goddess Nut, the mother of Osiris, was coming to gather up his poor scattered limbs and mould them with her own hands into a form immortal and divine. She gives thee thy head, she brings thee thy bones, she sets thy limbs together and puts thy heart in thy body. Thus the resurrection of the dead was conceived like that of Osiris, not merely as spiritual but also as bodily. They possess their heart, they possess their senses, they possess their mouth, they possess their feet, they possess their arms, they possess all their limbs. Combat between Set and Horus, the brother and the son of Osiris, for the crown of Egypt. If we may trust Egyptian legend, the trials and contests of the royal house did not cease with the restoration of Osiris to life and his elevation to the rank of presiding deity in the world of the dead. When Horus the younger, the son of Osiris and Isis, was grown to man's estate, the ghost of his royal and murdered father appeared to him and urged him, like another Hamlet, to avenge the foul, unnatural murder upon his wicked uncle. Thus encouraged, the youth attacked the miscreant. The combat was terrific and lasted many days. Horus lost an eye in the conflict, and Set suffered a still more serious mutilation. At last Thoth parted the combatants and healed their wounds. The eye of Horus he restored by spitting on it. According to one account, the great battle was fought on the 26th day of the month of Thoth. Foiled in open war, the artful uncle now took the law of his virtuous nephew. He brought a suit of bastardy against Horus, hoping thus to rob him of his inheritance and to get possession of it himself. Nay, not content with having murdered his good brother, the unnatural Set carried his rancor even beyond the grave by accusing the dead Osiris of certain high crimes and misdemeanors. The case was tried before the Supreme Court of the Gods in the Great Hall at Heliopolis. Thoth, the god of wisdom, pleaded the cause of Osiris, and the august judges decided that the word of Osiris was true. Moreover, they pronounced Horus to be the true begotten son of his father. So that prince assumed the crown and mounted the throne of the lamented Osiris. However, according to another and perhaps later version of the story, the victory of Horus over his uncle was by no means so decisive, and their struggles ended in a compromise, which Horus reigned over the delta, while Set became king of the upper valley of the Nile, from near Memphis to the first cataract. Be that as it may, with the ascension of Horus began, for the Egyptians, the modern period of the world, for on his throne all the kings of Egypt sat as his successors. The legend of their contest may be a reminiscence of dynastic struggles. These legends of a contest for the throne of Egypt may perhaps contain a reminiscence of real dynastical struggles, which attended an attempt to change the right of succession from the female to the male line. For under a rule of female kinship, the heir to the throne is either the late king's brother or the son of the late king's sister, or under a rule of male kinship, the heir to the throne is the late king's son. In the legend of Osiris, the rival heirs are Set and Horus, Set being the late king's brother and Horus the late king's son, though Horus indeed united both claims to the crown, being the son of the king's sister as well as of the king. A similar attempt to shift the line of succession seems to have given rise to similar contests at Rome. Osiris represented as a king in tradition and art. Thus, according to what seems to have been the general narrative tradition of Osiris, was a good and beloved king of Egypt, who suffered a violent death but rose from the dead and was henceforth worshipped as a deity. In harmony with this tradition, he was regularly represented by sculptors and painters in human and regal form as a dead king, swathed in the wrappings of a mummy, but wearing on his head a kingly crown and grasping in one of his hands, which were left free from the bandages, a kingly scepter. Two cities above all others were associated with his myth or memory. One of them was Busiris in Lower Egypt, which claimed to possess his backbone. The other was Abydos in Upper Egypt, which glorified the possession of his head. The tomb of Osiris at Abydos. Encircled by the nimbus of the dead yet living god, Abydos, originally an obscure place, became, from the end of the Old Kingdom, the holiest spot in Egypt. His tomb there would seem to have been to the Egyptians what the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem is to Christians. It was the wish of every pious man that his dead body should rest in the hallowed earth near the grave of the glorified Osiris. Few indeed were rich enough to enjoy this inestimable privilege. For apart from the cost of a tomb in the sacred city, the mere transport of mummies from great distances was both difficult and expensive. Yet so eager were many to absorb in death the blessed influence which radiated from the Holy Sepulchre that they caused their surviving friends to convey their mortal remains to Abydos, there to tarry for a short time and then to be brought back by river and interred in the tombs which had been made ready for them in their native land. Others had cenotaphs built or memorial tablets erected for themselves near the tomb of their dead and risen Lord, that they may share with him the bliss of a joyful resurrection. The tombs of the old king at Abydos. Hence, from the earliest ages of Egyptian history, Abydos would seem to have been a city of the dead rather than of the living. Certainly there is no evidence that the place was ever of any political importance. No less than 9 of the most ancient kings of Egypt known to us were buried here, for their tombs have been discovered and explored within recent years. The royal necropolis lies on the edge of the desert, about 1.5 miles from the temple of Osiris. The tomb of King Kent identified with the tomb of Osiris. Of the graves, the oldest is that of King Kent, the second or third king of the first dynasty. His reign, which fell somewhere between 3,400 and 3,200 years before our era, seems to have marked an epoch in the history of Egypt. For under him, the costume, the figure drawing, and the hieroglyphics all assumed the character which they thenceforth preserved to the very end of Egyptian nationality. Later ages identified him with Osiris in a more intimate sense than that in which the divine title was lavished on every dead king and indeed on every dead man, for his tomb was actually converted into the tomb of Osiris and as such received in great profusion the offerings of the faithful. Somewhere between the 22nd and the 26th dynasty, a massive bier of grey granite was placed in the sepulchral chamber. The sepulchral effigy of Osiris. On it, cut in high relief, reposes a shrouded figure of the dead Osiris. He lies at full length, with bare and upturned face. On his head is the white crown of Upper Egypt. In his hands, which issue from the shroud, he holds the characteristic emblems of the god, the scepter and the scourge. At the four corners of the bier are perched four hawks, representing the four children of Horus, each with their father's banner, keeping watch over the dead god as they kept watch over the four quarters of the world. A fifth hawk seems to have been perched on the middle of the body of Osiris, but it had been broken off before the tomb was discovered in recent years, for only the bird's claw remained in position. Finely carved heads of lions, one at each corner of the bier, with the claws to match below, complete the impressive monument. The scene represented is unquestionably the impregnation of Isis in the form of a hawk by the dead Osiris. The Copts who dismantled the shrine appear to have vented their pious rage on the figure of the hawk Isis by carrying it off or smashing it. If any doubt could exist as to the meaning of these sepulchred figures, it would be set at rest by the ancient inscriptions attached to them. Over against the right shoulder of the shrouded figure who lies stretched on the bier are carved the hieroglyphics, the words, Osiris, the good being true of speech. And over against the place where the missing hawk perched on the body of the dead god is carved the symbol of Isis. Two relics of the ancient human occupants of the tomb escaped alike the fury of the fanatics and the avarice of the plunderers who pillaged and destroyed it. One of the relics is a human skull, for which the lower jawbone is missing. The other is an arm encircled by gorgeous jeweled bracelets of gold, turquoises, amethysts, and dark purple lapis lazuli. The former may be the head of King Kent himself, the latter is almost certainly the arm of his queen. One of the bracelets is composed of alternate plaques of gold and turquoise, each ornamented with the figure of a hawk perched on the top of it. The hawk, the crest of the earliest dynasties. The hawk was a sacred bird or crest of the earliest dynasties of Egyptian kings. The figure of a hawk was borne before the king as a standard on solemn occasions. The oldest capital of the country known to us was called Hawk Town. There the kings of the first dynasty built a temple to the hawk. There in modern times has been found a splendid golden head of a hawk dating from the ancient empire. And on the lifelike statue of King Chephren of the third dynasty we see a hawk with outspread wings protecting the back of the monarch's head. From the earliest to the latest times of Egyptian civilization, the hawk was the epithet of the king of Egypt, and of the king alone, so it took the first place in the list of his titles. The sanctity of the bird may help us to understand why Isis took the form of a hawk in order to mate with her dead husband, why the Queen of Egypt bore on her arm a bracelet adorned with golden hawks, and why the Holy Sepulchre, the four sons of Horus, were represented in the likeness of hawks, keeping watch over the effigy of their divine grandfather. The association of Osiris with Byblos. The legend recorded by Plutarch which associates the dead Osiris with Byblos in Phoenicia is doubtless late and probably untrustworthy. It may have been suggested by the resemblance which the worship of the Egyptian Osiris bore to the worship of the Phoenician Adonis in that city, but it's possible that the story has no deeper foundation than a verbal misunderstanding. For Byblos is not only the name of a city, it is a Greek word for papyrus, and, as Isis is said after the death of Osiris, to have taken refuge in the papyrus swamps of the delta, where she gave birth to and reared her son Horus, a Greek writer may perhaps have confused the plant with the city of the same name. However, that may have been, the association of Osiris with Adonis at Byblos gave rise to a curious tale. It is said that every year the people beyond the rivers of Ethiopia used to write a letter to the women of Byblos informing them that the lost and lamented Adonis was found. This letter they enclosed in an earthen pot, which they sealed and sent floating down the river to the sea. The waves carried the pot to Byblos, where every year it arrived at the same time when the Syrian women were weeping for their dead lord. The pot was taken up from the water and opened. The letter was read, and the weeping women dried their tears because the lost Adonis was found. End of Section 1. Section 2 of The Golden Bough, Part 4. Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Volume 2, by Sir James George Frazer. Chapter 2. The Official Egyptian Calendar. The date of a festival sometimes furnishes a clue to the nature of the god. A useful clue to the original nature of a god or goddess is often furnished by the season at which his or her festival is celebrated. Thus, if the festival falls at the new or the full moon, there is a certain presumption that the deity thus honoured either is the moon or at least has lunar affinities. If the festival is held at the winter or summer solstice, we naturally surmise that the god is the sun, or at all events that he stands in some close relation to that luminary. Again, if the festival coincides with the time of sowing or harvest, we are inclined to infer that the divinity is an embodiment of the earth or of the corn. These presumptions, or inferences, taken by themselves, are by no means conclusive. But if they happen to be confirmed by other indications, the evidence may be regarded as fairly strong. The year of the Egyptian calendar, a vague or immovable one. Unfortunately, in dealing with the Egyptian gods, we are in a great measure precluded from making use of this clue. The reason is not that the dates of the festivals are always unknown, but that they shifted from year to year until after a long interval they had revolved through the whole course of the seasons. This gradual revolution of the festal Egyptian cycle resulted from the employment of a calendar year which neither corresponded exactly to the solar year nor was periodically corrected by intercalation. The solar year is equivalent to about 365 and a quarter days, but the ancient Egyptians, ignoring the quarter of a day, reckoned the year at 365 days only. Thus each of their calendar years was shorter than the true solar year by about a quarter of a day. In 4 years the deficiency amounted to 1 whole day, in 40 years it amounted to 10 days, in 400 years it amounted to 100 days, and so it went on, increasing until after a lapse of 4 times 365, or 1,460 solar years, the deficiency amounted to 365 days, or a whole Egyptian year. Hence 1,460 solar years, or their equivalent 1,461 Egyptian years, formed a period or cycle at the end of which the Egyptian festivals returned to those points of the solar year at which they had been celebrated in the beginning. In the meantime, they had been held successively on every day of the solar year, though always on the same day of the calendar. Thus the official calendar was divorced from the natural calendar, which is marked by the course of the seasons. Thus the official calendar was completely divorced, except at rare and long intervals, from what may be called the natural calendar of the shepherd, the husbandman, and the sailor. That is, from the course of the seasons in which the times of the various labours of cattle breeding, tillage, and navigation are marked by the position of the sun in the sky, the rising or setting of the stars, the fall of rain, the growth of pasture, the ripening of the corn, the blowing of certain winds, and so forth. Nowhere, perhaps, are the events of this natural calendar better marked or more regular in their occurrence than in Egypt. Nowhere, accordingly, could their diversions from the corresponding dates of the official calendar be more readily observed. The divergence certainly did not escape the notice of the Egyptians themselves, and some of them apparently attempted successfully to correct it. Thus we are told that the Theban priests, who particularly excelled in astronomy, were acquainted with the true length of the solar year, and harmonized the calendar with it by intercalating a day probably every 4 years. But this scientific improvement was too deeply opposed to the religious conservatism of the European nature to win general acceptance. The Egyptians, said Gemmius, a Greek astronomer writing about 77 BC, are of an opposite opinion and purpose from the Greeks, for they neither reckon the years by the sun nor the months and days by the moon, but they observe a peculiar system of their own. They wish, in fact, that the sacrifices should not always be offered to the gods at the same time of the year, but that they should pass through all the seasons of the year, so that the summer festival should in time be celebrated in winter, in autumn, and in spring. For that purpose they employ a year of 365 days, composed of 12 months of 30 days each, with 5 supplementary days added. But they do not add the quarter of a day, for the reason I have given, namely, in order that their festivals may revolve. So attached indeed were the Egyptians to their old calendar, that their kings at their consecration were led by the priest of Isis at Memphis into the Holy of Holies, and there made to swear that they would maintain the year of 365 days without intercalation. The practical inconvenience of a calendar which marked true time only once in about 1500 years might be calmly borne by a submissive Oriental race like the ancient Egyptians, but it naturally proved a stumbling block to the less patient temperament of their European conquerors. Attempt of Ptolemy III to reform the Egyptian calendar by intercalation. Accordingly, in the reign of King Ptolemy III, Euergetes, a decree was passed that henceforth the movable Egyptian year should be converted into a fixed solar year by the intercalation of one day at the end of every 4 years, in order that the seasons may do their duty perpetually according to the present constitution of the world, and that it may not happen through the shifting of the star by 1 day in 4 years, that some of the public festivals which are now held in the winter should ever be celebrated in the summer, and that other festivals now held in the summer should hereafter be celebrated in the winter, as has happened before and must happen again if the year of 365 days be retained. The decree was passed in the year 239 or 238 BC by the high priests, scribes, and other dignitaries of the Egyptian church assembled in convocation at Canopus. But we cannot doubt that the measure, though it embodied native European science, was prompted by the king or his Macedonian advisors. This sage attempted to reform the erratic calendar was not permanently successful. The change may indeed have been carried out during the reign of the king who instituted it, but it was abandoned by the year 196 BC. At latest, as we learn from the celebrated inscription known as the Rosetta Stone, in which a month of the Macedonian calendar is equated to the corresponding month of the movable Egyptian year. And the testimony of Gemmius, which I have cited, proves that in the following century the festivals were still revolving in the old style. Institution of the fixed Alexandrian year by the Romans. The reform which the Macedonian king had vainly attempted to impose upon his people was accomplished by the practical Romans when they took over the administration of the country. The expedient by which they effected the change was a simple one. Indeed, it was no other than that to which Ptolemy Euergetes had resorted for the same purpose. They merely intercalated 1 day at the end of every 4 years, thus equalizing within a small fraction 4 calendar years to 4 solar years. Henceforth, the official and the natural calendars were in practical agreement. The movable Egyptian year had been converted into the fixed Alexandrian year, as was called, which agreed with the Julian year in length and in its system of intercalation, though it differed from that year in retaining the 12 equal Egyptian months and 5 supplementary days. But while the new calendar received the sanction of law and regulated the business of government, the ancient calendar was too firmly established in popular usage to be at once displaced. Accordingly, it survived for ages side by side with its modern rival. The spread of Christianity, which required a fixed year for the due observations of its festivals, did much to promote the adoption of the new Alexandrian style, and by the beginning of the 5th century, the ancient movable year of Egypt appears to have been not only dead, but forgotten. End of section 2. Section 3 of the Golden Bough, Part 4, Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Volume 2, by Sir James George Frazer. Chapter 3, The Calendar of the Egyptian Farmer. Part 1, The Rise and Fall of the Nile. In Egypt, the operations of husbandry are dependent on the annual rise and fall of the Nile. If the Egyptian farmer in the olden time could thus get no help, except at the rarest intervals, from the official or sacerdotal calendar, he must have been compelled to observe for himself those natural signals which marked the times for the various operations of husbandry. In all ages of which we possess any records, the Egyptians have been an agricultural people, dependent for their subsistence on the growth of the corn. The cereals which they cultivated were wheat, barley, and apparently sorghum, Holcus sorghum linnaeus, the dura of the modern fellahin. Then as now, the whole country, with the exception of a fringe on the coast of the Mediterranean, was almost rainless, and owed its immense fertility entirely to the annual inundation of the Nile, which, regulated by an elaborate system of dams and canals, was distributed over the fields, renewing the soil year by year with a fresh deposit of mud washed down from the great equatorial lakes and the mountains of Abyssinia. Hence the rise of the river has always been watched by the inhabitants with the utmost anxiety, for if it either falls short of or exceeds a certain height, dearth and famine are the inevitable consequences. The water begins to rise early in June, but it is not until the latter half of July that it swells to a mighty tide. By the end of September, the inundation is at its greatest height. The country is now submerged and presents the appearance of a sea of turbid water from which the towns and villages, built on higher ground, rise like islands. For about a month the flood remains nearly stationary, then sinks more and more rapidly, till by December or January the river has returned to its ordinary bed. With the approach of summer, the level of the water continues to fall. In the early days of June, the Nile is reduced to half its ordinary breadth, and Egypt, scorched by the sun, blasted by the wind that has blown from the Sahara for many days, seems a mere continuation of the desert. The trees are choked with a thick layer of grey dust. A few meagre patches of vegetables, watered with difficulty, struggle painfully for existence in the immediate neighbourhood of the villages. Some appearance of verdure lingers beside the canal and the hollows from which the moisture has not wholly evaporated. The plain appears to pant in the pitiless sunshine, bare, dusty, ash-coloured, cracked and seamed as far as the eye can see with a network of fissures. From the middle of April to the middle of June, the land of Egypt is but half alive, waiting for the new Nile. Irrigation, sowing and harvest in Egypt. For countless ages, this cycle of natural events has determined the annual labours of the Egyptian husbandman. The first work of the agricultural year is the cutting of the dams which have hitherto prevented the swollen river from flooding the canals and the fields. This is done, and the pent-up waters released on that beneficent mission in the first half of August. In November, when the inundation has subsided, wheat, barley and sorghum are sown. The time of harvest varies, with the district falling about a month later in the north than in the south. In upper or southern Egypt, barley is reaped at the beginning of March, wheat at the beginning of April, and sorghum about the end of that month. The events of the agricultural year were probably celebrated with religious rites. It is natural to suppose that these various events of the agricultural year were celebrated by the Egyptian farmer with some simple religious rites designed to secure the blessing of the gods upon his labours. These rustic ceremonies he would continue to perform year after year at the same season, while the solemn festivals of the priests continue to shift, with the shifting calendar from summer through spring to winter, and so backward through autumn to summer. The rites of the husbandman were stable because they rested on direct observation of nature. The rites of the priest were unstable because they were based on a false calculation. Yet many of the priestly festivals may have been nothing but the old rural festivals disguised by the course of ages by the pomp and sacerdotalism and severed by the error of the calendar from their roots in the natural cycle of the seasons. Part 2. Rites of Irrigation. Mourning for Osiris in midsummer when the Nile begins to rise. These conjectures are confirmed by the little we know both of the popular and of the official Egyptian religion. Thus we are told that the Egyptians held a festival of Isis at the time when the Nile began to rise. They believed that the goddess was then mourning for the lost Osiris, and that the tears which dropped from her eyes swelled the impetuous tide of the river. Hence in Egyptian inscriptions Isis is spoken of as she who maketh the Nile to swell and overflow, who maketh the Nile to swell in his season. Similarly, the Torajas of Central Celebes imagine that showers of rain are the tears shed by the compassionate gods in weeping for somebody who is about to die. A shower in the morning is to them an infallible omen of death. However, an uneasy suspicion would seem to have occurred to the Egyptians that perhaps all the tears of the goddess might not suffice of themselves to raise the water to the proper level, so that in the time of Ramesses II, the king used on the first day of the flood to throw into the Nile a written order commanding the river to do its duty. And the submissive stream never failed to obey the royal mandate. Yet the ancient belief survives in a modern form to this day. For the Nile, as we saw, begins to rise in June about the time of the summer solstice, and the people still attribute its increased volume to a miraculous drop which falls into the river on the night of the 17th of the month. The charms and divinations which they practice on that mystic night in order to ascertain the length of their own life and to rid the house of bugs may well date from a remote antiquity. Now if Osiris was, in one of his aspects, a god of the corn, nothing could be more natural than that he should be mourned at midsummer. For by that time the harvest was past, the fields were bare, the river ran low, life seemed to be suspended, the corn god was dead. At such a moment, people who saw the handiwork of divine beings in all the operations of nature might well trace the swelling of the sacred stream to the tears shed by the goddess at the death of the beneficent corn god, her husband. Sirius regarded as the star of Isis, and the sign of the rising waters on earth was accompanied by a sign in heaven. For in the early days of Egyptian history, some 3,000 or 4,000 years before the beginning of our era, the splendid star of Sirius, the brightest of all the fixed stars, appeared at dawn in the east just before sunrise about the time of the summer solstice, when the Nile begins to rise. The Egyptians called it Sothis, and regarded it as a star of Isis, just as the Babylonians deemed the planet Venus the star of Astarte. To both peoples, apparently, the brilliant luminary in the morning sky seemed the goddess of life and love come to mourn her departed lover or spouse and to wake him from the dead. The rising of Sirius marked the beginning of the sacred Egyptian year. Hence the rising of Sirius marked the beginning of the sacred Egyptian year, and was regularly celebrated by a festival which did not shift with the shifting of the official year. The first day of the month, Thoth, was theoretically supposed to date from the heliacal rising of the bright star, and in all probability it really did so when the official or civil year of 365 days was first instituted. But the miscalculation, which has been already explained, had the effect of making the star to shift its place in the calendar by 1 day in 4 years. Thus if Sirius rose on the 1st of Thoth in 1 year, it would rise on the 2nd of Thoth 4 years afterwards, on the 3rd of Thoth 8 years afterwards, and so on until the lapse of a Ziraic or Sothic period of 1460 solar years. The 1st of Thoth again coincided with the heliacal rising of Sirius. The observation of the gradual displacement of Sirius in the calendar led to the determination of the true length of the solar year. The observation of the gradual displacement of the star in the calendar had been of the utmost importance for the progress of astronomy, since it led the Egyptians directly to the determination of the approximately true length of the solar year, and thus laid the basis of our modern calendar. For the Julian calendar, which we owe to Caesar, was founded on the Egyptian theory, though not on the Egyptian practice. It was therefore a fortunate moment in the world when some pious Egyptian, thousands of years ago, identified for the first time the bright star of Sirius with his goddess. For the identification induced his countrymen to regard the heavenly body with an attention which they would never have paid to it if they had known it to be nothing but a world vastly greater than our own, and separated from it by an inconceivable, if not immeasurable, abyss of space. Ceremonies observed in Egypt at the cutting of the dams early in August. The cutting of the dams and the emission of the water into the canals and fields is a great event in the Egyptian year. At Cairo, the operation generally takes place between the 6th and the 16th of August, and until lately was attended by ceremonies which deserve to be noticed, because they were probably handed down from antiquity. An ancient canal, known by the name of Khalij, formerly passed through the native town of Cairo. Near its entrance, the canal was crossed by a dam of earth, very broad at the bottom and diminishing in breadth upwards, which used to be constructed before or soon after the Nile began to rise. In front of the dam, on the side of the river, was reared a truncated cone of earth called the Aruseh, or bride, on the top of which a little maize or millet was generally sown. The bride of the Nile. This bride was commonly washed down by the rising tide a week or a fortnight before the cutting of the dam. Tradition runs that the old custom was to deck a young virgin in gay apparel and throw her into the river as a sacrifice to obtain a plentiful inundation. Sacrifices offered by savages at the cutting of dams. Certainly human sacrifices were offered for a similar purpose by the Wajaga of German East Africa down to recent years. These people irrigate their fields by means of skillfully constructed channels, through which they conduct the water of the mountain brooks and rivers to the thirsty land. They imagine that the spirits of their forefathers dwell in the rocky basins of these rushing streams, and that they would resent the withdrawal of the water to irrigate the fields if compensation were not offered to them. The water rate paid to them consisted of a child, uncircumcised and of unblemished body, who was decked with ornaments and bells and thrown into the river to drown before they ventured to draw off the water into the irrigation channel. Having thrown him in, his executioners showed a clean pair of heels, because they expected the river to rise in flood at once on receipt of the water rate. In similar circumstances, the Najumos of British East Africa sacrifice a sheep before they let the water of the stream flow into the ditch or artificial channel. The fat, dung, and blood of the animal are sprinkled at the mouth of the ditch and in the water. Thereupon the dam is broken down and the stream pours into the ditch. The sacrifice may only be offered by a man of the Il-Mayak clan, and for 2 days afterwards he wears the skin of the beast tied around his head. No one may quarrel with this man while the water is irrigating the crops, else the people believe that the water would cease to flow in the ditch. More than that, if the men of the Il-Mayak clan were angry and sulked for 10 days, the water would dry up permanently for that season. Hence the Il-Mayak clan enjoys a great consideration in the tribe, since the crops are thought to depend on their goodwill and good offices. 10 elders assist at the sacrifice of the sheep, though they make no part in it. They must all be of a particular age, and after the ceremony they may not cohabit with their wives until harvest, and they are obliged to sleep at night in their granaries. Curiously enough too, while the water is irrigating the fields, nobody may kill waterbuck, eland, oryx, zebra, rhinoceros or hippopotamus. Anybody caught red-handed in the act of breaking this game law would at once be cast out of the village. Modern Egyptian ceremony at the cutting of the dams. Whether the bride who used to figure in the ceremony of cutting the dam in Cairo was ever a live woman or not, the intention of the practice appears to have been to marry the river, conceived as a male power, to his bride, the corn land, which was soon to be fertilized by his water. The ceremony was therefore a charm to ensure the growth of the crops. As such, it probably dated in one form or another from ancient times. Dense crowds assembled to witness the cutting of the dam, The operation was performed before sunrise, and many people spent the preceding night on the banks of the canal or in boats lit with lamps on the river, while fireworks were displayed and guns discharged at frequent intervals. Before sunrise, a great number of workmen began to cut the dam, and the task was accomplished before an hour before the sun appeared on the horizon. When only a thin ridge of earth remained, a boat with an officer on board was propelled against it, and breaking through the slight barrier descended with the rush of water into the canal. The governor of Cairo flung a purse of gold into the boat as it passed. Formerly the custom was to throw money into the canal. A populace used to dive after it, and several lives are generally lost in the scramble. This practice would also seem to have been ancient, for Seneca tells us that at a place called the Veins of the Nile, not far from Philae, the priests used to cast money and offerings of gold into the river at a festival which apparently took place at the rising of the water. At Cairo, the time-honoured ceremony came to an end in 1897 when the old canal was filled up. An electric tramway now runs over the spot where for countless ages crowds of worshippers or holiday makers had annually assembled to witness the marriage of the Nile. Part 3. The Rites of Sowing. The sowing of the seed in November. The next great operation of the agricultural year in Egypt is the sowing of the seed in November, when the water of the inundation has retreated from the fields. With the Egyptians, as with many peoples of antiquity, the committing of the seed to the earth assumed the character of a solemn and mournful rite. Plutarch on the mournful character of the rites of sowing. On this subject I will let Plutarch speak for himself. What, he asks, are we to make of the gloomy, joyless and mournful sacrifices, if it is wrong either to omit the established rites or to confuse and disturb our conceptions of the gods by absurd suspicions? For the Greeks also perform many rites, which resemble those of the Egyptians, and are observed about the same time. Thus at the festival of the Thesmophoria in Athens, women sit on the ground and fast, and the Boeotians open the vaults of the Sorrowful One, naming that festival sorrowful because Demeter is sorrowing for the descent of the maiden. The month is a month of sowing, about the setting of the Pleiades. The Egyptians called it Aether, the Athenians Pianepsion, the Boeotians the month of Demeter. Theopompus informs us that the Western peoples consider the call of winter Cronus, the summer Aphrodite, and the spring Persephone, and they believe that all things are brought into being by Cronus and Aphrodite. The Phrygians imagine that the god sleeps in winter and wakes in summer, and accordingly they celebrate with Bacchic rites and putting him to bed in winter and his awakening in summer. The Paphlagoians allege that he is bound fast and shut up in winter, but that he stirs and is set free in spring. The sadness of autumn. And the season furnishes a hint that the sadness is for hiding of those fruits of the earth which the ancients esteemed, not indeed gods, but great and necessary gifts bestowed by the gods in order that men might not lead the life of savages and of wild beasts. For it was that time of year when they saw some of the fruits vanishing and failing from the trees, while they sowed others grudgingly and with difficulty, scraping the earth with their hands and huddling it up again, on the uncertain chance that what they deposited in the ground would ever ripen and come to maturity. Thus they did in many respects like those who bury and mourn their dead, and just as we say that a purchaser of Plato's books purchases Plato, or that an actor who plays the comedies of Menander plays Menander, so the men of old did not hesitate to call the gifts and products of the gods by the names of the gods themselves, thereby honouring and glorify the things on account of their utility. But in after ages, simple folk in their ignorance applied to the gods statements which only held true of the fruits of the earth. And so they came not merely to say, but actually to believe, that the growth and decay of plants on which they subsisted were the birth and the death of gods. Thus they fell into absurd, immoral, and confused ways of thinking, though all the while the absurdity of the fallacy was manifest. Hence Xenophans of Colophon declared that if the Egyptians deemed their gods divine, they should not weep for them, and that if they wept for them they should not deem them divine. For it is ridiculous, said he, to lament and pray that the fruits would be good enough to grow and ripen again, in order that they may again be eaten and lamented. But he was wrong, for though the lamentations are for the fruits, the prayers are addressed to the gods, as the causers and givers of them, that they would be pleased to make fresh fruits to spring up instead of those that perish. Plutarch's view that the worship of the fruits of the earth sprang from a verbal misunderstanding. In this interesting passage, Plutarch expresses his belief that the worship of the fruits of the earth was a result of a verbal misapprehension, or disease of language as it has been called by a modern school of mythologists who explain the origin of myths in general on the same easy principles of metaphors misunderstood. Primitive man, on Plutarch's theory, firmly believed that the fruits of the earth on which he subsisted were not themselves gods, but merely the gifts of the gods, who were the real givers of all good things. Yet at the same time, men were in the habit of bestowing on these divine products the names of divine creators, either out of gratitude or merely for the sake of brevity. As when we say that a man has bought Shakespeare or acted Molière, when we mean that he has bought the works of Shakespeare or acted the plays of Molière. The abbreviated mode of expression was misunderstood in later times, and so people came to look upon the fruits of the earth as themselves divine instead of as being the work of divinities. In short, they mistook the creature for the creator. In like manner, Plutarch would explain the Egyptian worship of animals as reverence done not so much to the beasts themselves as to the great god who displayed the divine handiwork in sentient organisms, even more than in the most beautiful and wonderful works of inanimate nature. His theory is an inversion of the truth, or fetishism is the antecedent, not the corruption of theism. The comparative study of religion has proved that these theories of Plutarch are an inversion of the truth. Fetishism, or the view that the fruits of the earth and things in general are divine or animated by powerful spirits, is not, as Plutarch imagined, a late corruption of a pure and primitive theism, which regarded the gods as the creators and givers of all good things. On the contrary, fetishism is early and theism is late in the history of mankind. In this respect, Xenophans, whom Plutarch attempts to correct, displayed a much truer insight into the mind of the savage. Lamentations of the savage for the animals and plants which he kills and eats. To weep crocodile tears over the animals and plants which he kills and eats, and to pray them to come again in order that they may be eaten again and again lamented. This may seem absurd to us, but is precisely what the savage does. And from his point of view, the proceeding is not at all absurd, but perfectly rational and well calculated to answer his ends. For he sincerely believes that animals and fruits are tenanted by spirits who can harm him if they please, and who cannot be put to considerable inconvenience by that destruction of their bodies which is unfortunately inseparable from the process of mastication and digestion. What more natural, therefore, than that the savage should offer excuses to the beasts and the fruits for the painful necessity he is under of consuming them, and that he should endeavour to alleviate their pangs by soft words and an air of respectful sympathy, in order that they may bear him no grudge, and may in due time come again, to be again eaten and again lamented. Judged by the standard of primitive manners, the attitude of the walrus to the oysters was strictly correct. "I weep for you," the walrus said. "I deeply sympathize." With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the larger size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Respect shown by savages for the fruits and the animals which they eat. Many examples of such hypocritical lamentations for animals, drawn not from the fancy of a playful writer, but from the facts of savage life, could be cited. Here I shall quote the general statement of a writer on the Indians of British Columbia, because it covers the case of vegetable as well as of animal food. After describing the respectful welcome accorded by the Stlatlam Indians to the first sockeye salmon which they have caught in the season. He goes on, "The significance of these ceremonies is easy to perceive when we remember the attitude of the Indians towards nature generally, and recall their myths relating to the salmon and their coming to their rivers and streams. Nothing that the Indian of this region eats is regarded by him as mere food and nothing more. Not a single plant, animal or fish, or the object upon which he feeds is looked upon in this light, or as something he has secured for himself by his own wit and skill. He regards it rather as something which has been voluntarily and compassionately placed in his hands by the goodwill and consent of the spirit of the object itself, or by the intercession and magic of his culture heroes, to be retained and used by him only upon the fulfillment of certain conditions. These conditions include respect and reverent care in the killing or plucking of the animal or plant, and proper treatment of the parts he has no use for, such as the bones, blood and offal, and the depositing of the same in some stream or lake, so that the object may by that means renew its life in physical form. The practices in connection with the killing of animals and the gathering of plants and fruits all make this quite clear, and it is only when we bear this attitude of the savage towards nature in mind that we can hope to rightly understand the motives and purposes of many of his strange customs and beliefs. Thus the lamentations of the sower become intelligible. We can now understand why among many peoples of antiquity, as Plutarch tells us, the time of sowing was a time of sorrow. The laying of the seed in the earth was a burial of the divine element, and it was fitting that, like a human burial, it should be performed with gravity and the semblance, if not the reality, of sorrow. Yet they sorrowed not without hope, perhaps a sure and certain hope, that the seed which they thus committed with sighs and tears to the ground would yet rise from the dust and yield fruit 100-fold to the reaper. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. He that goes forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. Part 4. The Rites of Harvest. Lamentations of the Egyptian Corn Reapers. The Egyptian harvest, as we have seen, falls not in autumn but in spring, in the months of March, April and May. To the husbandman, the time of harvest, at least in a good year, must necessarily be a season of joy. In bringing home his sheaves, he is requited for his long and anxious labours. Yet if the old Egyptian farmer felt a secret joy at reaping and garnering the grain, it was essential that he should conceal the natural emotion under an air of profound dejection. For was he not severing the body of the corn god with his sickle and trampling it to pieces under the hoofs of his cattle on the threshing floor? Accordingly, we are told that it was an ancient custom of the Egyptian corn reapers to beat their breasts and lament over the first sheaf cut, while at the same time they called upon Isis. The invocation seems to have taken the form of a melancholy chant, to which the Greeks gave the name Menaros. Similar plaintive strains were chanted by corn reapers in Phoenicia and other parts of Western Asia. Probably all these doleful ditties were lamentations for the corn god killed by the sickles of the reapers. In Egypt, the slain deity was Osiris, and the name Menaros, applied to the dirge, appears to be derived from certain words meaning "come to thy house," which often recur in the lamentations for the dead god. Similar ceremonies observed by the Cherokee Indians in the cultivation of the corn. Ceremonies of the same sort have been observed by other peoples, probably for the same purpose. Thus we're told that among all vegetables, corn, selu, by which is apparently meant maize, holds the first place in the household economy and the ceremonial observance of the Cherokee Indians, who invoke it under the name of the Old Woman, in allusion to a myth that it sprang from the blood of an old woman killed by her disobedient sons. Much ceremony accompanied the planting and tending of the crop. 7 grains, the sacred number, were put into each hill, and these were not afterwards thinned out. After the last working of the crop, the priest and an assistant, generally the owner of the field, went into the field and built a small enclosure in the centre. Then entering it, They seated themselves upon the ground, with heads bent down, and while the assistant kept perfect silence, the priest, with rattle in hand, sang songs of invocation to the spirit of the corn. Soon, according to the orthodox belief, a loud rustling would be heard outside, which they would know was caused by the old woman bringing the corn into the field, but neither must look upon until the song was finished. The old woman of the corn and the laments for her death. This ceremony was repeated on 4 successive nights, after which no one entered the field for 7 other nights, when the priest himself went in, and, if all the sacred regulations had been properly observed, was rewarded by finding young ears upon the stalks. The corn ceremonies could be performed by the owner of the field himself, provided he was willing to pay a sufficient fee to the priest in order to keep the songs and ritual. Care was always taken to keep a clean trail from the field to the house, so that the corn might be encouraged to stay at home and not go wandering elsewhere. Most of these customs are now fallen into disuse, except among the old people, by many of whom they are still religiously observed. Another curious ceremony, of which even the memory is now almost forgotten, was enacted after the first working of the corn, when the owner or priest stood in succession at each of the 4 corners of the field and wept and wailed loudly. Even the priests are now unable to give a reason for this performance, which may have been a lament for the bloody death of Selu, the old woman of the corn. In these Cherokee practices, the lamentations and the invocations of the old woman of the corn resemble the ancient Egyptian custom of lamenting over the first corn cut and calling upon Isis herself, probably in one of her aspects an old woman of the corn. Further, the Cherokee precaution of leaving a clear path from the field to the house resembles the Egyptian invitation to Osiris, "Come to thy house." So in the East Indies, to this day, people observe elaborate ceremonies for the purpose of bringing back the soul of the rice from the fields to the barn. The Nandi of British East Africa perform a ceremony in September when the Eleusine grain is ripening. Every woman who owns a plantation goes out with her daughters into the cornfields and makes a bonfire of the branches and leaves of certain trees, the Selenum camplantium and Lantana savifolia. After that, they pluck some of the Eleusine, and each of them puts 1 grain in her necklace, chews another, and rubs it on her forehead, throat, and breast. No joy is shown by the womenfolk on this occasion, and they sorrowfully cut a basket of the corn, which they take home with them and place in the loft to dry. Just as the Egyptians lamented at cutting the corn, so the Korak Indians of California lament at hewing their sacred wood for the fire in the assembly room. Lamentations of Indians at cutting sacred wood. The wood must be cut from a tree on the top of the highest hill. In lopping off the boughs, the Indian weeps and sobs piteously, shedding real tears. At the top of the tree he leaves 2 branches and a top knot, resembling a man's head and outstretched arms. Having descended from the tree, he binds the wood in a faggot and carries it back to the assembly room, blubbering all the way. If he is asked why he thus weeps at cutting and fetching the sacred fuel, he will either give no answer, or say simply that he does it for luck. We may suspect that his real motive is to appease the wrath of the tree spirit, many of whose limbs he has amputated, though he took care to leave him 2 arms and a head. Arab ceremony of burying the old man at harvest. The conception of the corn spirit as old and dead at harvest is very clearly embodied in a custom observed by the Arabs of Moab. When the harvesters have nearly finished their task and a small corner of the field remains to be reaped, the owner takes a handful of wheat tied up in a sheath. A hole is dug in the form of a grave and 2 stones are set upright, one at the head and the other at the foot, just as in the ordinary burial. Then the sheaf of wheat is laid at the bottom of the grave, and the sheikh pronounces these words, "The old man is dead." Earth is afterwards thrown in to cover the sheaf with a prayer, "May Allah bring us back the wheat of the dead." End of Section 3. Section 4 of The Golden Bough, Part 4, Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Volume 2, by Sir James George Frazer, Chapter 4, Part 1. The Official Festivals of Osiris. Part 1. The Festival at Sais. With the adoption of the Alexandrian year in 30 BC, the Egyptian festivals ceased to rotate through the natural year. Such then were the principal events of the farmer's calendar in ancient Egypt, and such the simple religious rites by which he celebrated them. But we have still to consider the Osirian festivals of the official calendar, so far as these are described by Greek writers or recorded on the monuments. In examining them, it is necessary to bear in mind that on account of the movable year of the old Egyptian calendar, the true or astronomical dates of the official festivals must have varied from year to year, at least until the adoption of the fixed Alexandrian year in 30 BC. From that time onward, apparently, the dates of the festivals were determined by the new calendar, and so ceased to rotate through the length of the solar year. At all events, Plutarch, writing about the end of the 1st century, implies that they were then fixed, not movable, for though he does not mention the Alexandrian calendar, he clearly dates the festivals by it. Moreover, the long festal calendar of Esni, an important document of the imperial age, is obviously based on the fixed Alexandrian year, for it assigns the mark for New Year's Day to the day which corresponds to the 29th of August, which was the first day of the Alexandrian year, and its references to the rising of the Nile, the position of the sun, and the operations of agriculture are all in harmony with this supposition. Thus we may take it as fairly certain that from 30 BC onwards, the Egyptian festivals were stationary in the solar year. The sufferings of Osiris displayed as a mystery at Sais. Herodotus tells us that the grave of Osiris was at Sais in Lower Egypt, and that there was a lake thereupon which the sufferings of the god were displayed as a mystery by night. This commemoration of the divine passion was held once a year. The people mourned and beat their breasts at it to testify their sorrow for the death of the god, and an image of a cow made of gilt wood with a golden sun between its horns was carried out of the chamber in which it stood the rest of the year. The cow no doubt represented Isis herself, for cows were sacred to her, and she was regularly depicted with the horns of a cow on her head, or even as a woman with the head of a cow. It is probable that the carrying out of her cow-shaped image symbolized the goddess searching for the dead body of Osiris, for this was the native Egyptian interpretation of a similar ceremony observed in Plutarch's time about the winter solstice, when the gilt cow was carried 7 times around the temple. A great feature of the festival was the nocturnal illumination. People fastened rows of oil lamps to the outside of their houses, and lamps burned all night long. The custom was not confined to Sais, but was observed throughout the whole of Egypt. The illumination of houses throughout Egypt on the night of the festival suggests that the rite was a feast of all souls. This universal illumination of the houses on one night of the year suggests that the festival may have been a commemoration not merely of the dead Osiris, but of the dead in general. In other words, that it may have been a night of all souls. For it is a widespread belief that the souls of the dead revisit their old homes on one night of the year, and on that solemn occasion people prepare for the reception of the ghosts by laying out food for them to eat, and lighting lamps to guide them on their dark road from and to the grave. The following instances will illustrate the custom. Part 2. Feast of All Souls. Annual Festival of the Dead among the Eskimos. The Eskimos of St. Michael and the lower Yukon River in Alaska hold a festival of the dead every year at the end of November or the beginning of December, as well as a greater festival at intervals of several years. At these seasons, food, drink and clothes are provided for the returning ghosts in the kashium, or clubhouse of the village, which is illuminated with oil lamps. The lighting of the lamps for the dead. Every man or woman who wishes to honor a dead friend sets up a lamp on a stand in front of the place which the deceased used to occupy in the clubhouse. These lamps filled with seal oil are kept burning day and night till the festival is over. They are believed to light the shades on their return to their old home and back again to the land of the dead. If anyone fails to put up a lamp in the clubhouse and to keep it burning, the shade whom he or she desires to honour could not find its way to the place and so would miss the feast. Eskimo Festival of the Dead. On the eve of the festival, the nearest male relation goes to the grave and summons a ghost by planting there a small model of a seal spear or of a wooden dish, according as the deceased was a man or a woman. The badges of the dead are marked on these implements. When all is ready, the ghosts gather in the fire pit under the clubhouse and, ascending through the floor at the proper moment, take possession of the bodies of their namesakes, to whom the offerings of food, drink and clothing are made for the benefit of the dead. Thus each shade obtains the supplies he needs in the other world. The dead who have none to make offerings to them are believed to suffer great destitution. Hence the Eskimos fear to die without leaving behind them someone who was sacrificed to their spirits, and childless people generally adopt children lest their shade should be forgotten at the festivals. When a person has been much disliked, his ghost is sometimes purposely ignored, and that is deemed the severest punishment that could be inflicted upon him. After the songs of invitation to the dead have been sung, the givers of the feast take a small portion of food from every dish and cast it down as an offering to the shades. Then each pours little water on the floor so that it runs through the cracks. In this way they believe that the spiritual essence of all the food and water is conveyed to the souls. The remainder of the food is afterwards distributed among the people present, who eat of it heartily. Then with songs and dances the feast comes to an end and the ghosts are dismissed to their own place. Dances form a conspicuous feature of the great festival of the dead, which is held every few years. The dancers dance not only in the clubhouse, but also at the graves and on the ice, if the deceased met their death by drowning. Annual Festivals of the Dead among the Indians of California. The Indians of California used to observe annual ceremonies of mourning for the dead, at some of which the souls of the departed were represented by living persons. 10 or more men would prepare themselves to play the part of the ghosts by fasting for several days, especially by abstaining from flesh. Disguised with paint and soot, adorned with feathers and grasses, they danced and sang in the village or rushed about in the forest by night with burning torches in their hands. After a time they presented themselves to the relations of the deceased, who looked upon these maskers as in very truth their departed friends, and received them accordingly with an outburst of lamentation. The old women scratched their own faces and smiting their breasts with stones in token of mourning. These masquerades were generally held in February. During their continuance, a strict fast was observed in the village. Among the Concours of California, the Dance of the Dead is always held about the end of August and marks their New Year's Day. They collect a large quantity of food, clothing, baskets, ornaments, and whatever else the spirits are supposed to need in the other world. These they hang on a semicircle of boughs or small trees, cut and set in the ground leafless. In the centre burns a great fire, and hard by are the graves. The ceremony begins at evening and lasts till daybreak. As darkness falls, men and women sit on the graves and wail for the dead of the year. Then they dance round the fire with frenzied yells and whoops, casting from time to time the offerings into the flames. All must be consumed before the first faint streaks of dawn glimmer in the east. Annual Festival of the Dead among the Choctaws and Pueblo Indians. The Choctaws used to have a great respect for their dead. They did not bury their bodies, but laid them on biers made of bark and supported by forked sticks about 15 feet high. When the worms had consumed the flesh, the skeleton was dismembered. Any remains of muscles and sinews were buried, and the bones were deposited in a box, the skull being reddened with ochre. The box containing the bones was then carried to the common burial ground. In the early days of November, the tribe celebrated a great festival which they called the Festival of the Dead or of the Souls. Every family then gathered in the common burial ground, and there with weeping and lamentation visited the boxes which contained the mouldering relics of their dead. On returning from the graveyard, they held a great banquet, which ended the festival. Some of the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico believe that on a certain day, in August I think, the dead rise from their graves and flit about the neighbouring hills, and on that day all who have lost friends carry out quantities of corn, bread, meat, and such other good things of this life as they can obtain, and place them in the haunts frequented by the dead, in order that the departed spirits may once more enjoy the comforts of this nether world. They have been encouraged in this belief by the priests, who are in the habit of sending out and appropriating to themselves all these things, and then making the poor simple Indians believe that the dead had eaten them. Annual Festival of the Dead among the Mixtecs of Mexico. The Mixtecs of Mexico believed that the souls of the dead came back on the 12th month of every year, which corresponded to our November. On this day of All Souls, the houses were decked out to welcome the spirits. Jars of food and drink were set on a table in the principal room, and the family went forth to torches to meet the ghosts and invite them to enter. Then returning themselves to the house, they knelt round the table, and with eyes bent on the ground, prayed the souls to accept of their offerings and to procure the blessings of the gods upon the family. Thus they remained on bended knees and with downcast eyes till the morning, not daring to look at the table lest they should offend the spirits by spying on them at their meal. With the first beams of the sun they rose, glad at heart. The jars of food which being presented to the dead were given to the poor or deposited in a secret place. The Indians of Santiago Tepehuacan believe that the souls of their dead return to them on the night of the 18th of October, the festival of St. Luke, and they sweep the roads in order that ghosts may find them clean on their passage. Annual Festival of the Dead in Samba. Again, the natives of Samba, an East Indian island, celebrate a New Year's festival, which is at the same time a festival of the dead. The graves are in the middle of the village, and at a given moment all the people repair to them and raise a loud weeping and wailing. Then after indulging for a short time in the national pastimes, they disperse to their houses, and every family calls upon its dead to come back. The ghosts are believed to hear and accept the invitation. Accordingly, betel and areca nuts are set out for them. Victims too are sacrificed in front of every house, and their hearts and livers are offered with rice to the dead. After a decent interval, these portions are distributed among the living, who consume them and banquet gaily on flesh and rice, a rare event in their frugal lives. Then they play, dance and sing to their heart's content, and the festival which began so lugubriously ends by being the merriest of the year. A little before daybreak, the invisible guests take their departure. All the people turn out of their houses to escort them a little way, holding in one hand the half of a coconut which contains a small packet of provisions for the dead, and in the other hand a piece of smouldering wood. They march in procession, singing a drawling song to the accompaniment of a gong and waving their lighted brands in time to the music. So they move through the darkness till with the last words of the song they throw away the coconuts and the brands in the direction of the spirit land, leaving the ghosts to wend their way thither while they themselves return to the village. Annual Festival of the Dead in Kiriwina. In Kiriwina, one of the Trobriand Islands to the east of New Guinea, the spirits of the ancestors are believed to revisit their native village in a body once a year after the harvest has been got in. At this time, the men perform special dances. The people openly display their valuables, spread out on platforms, and great feasts are made for the spirits. On a certain night, when the moon is at the full, all the people raise a great shout, and so drive away the spirits to the spirit land. Festival of the Dead among the Sea Dyaks of Borneo. The Sea Dyaks of Borneo celebrate a great festival in honour of the dead at irregular intervals. It may be 1 or more years after the death of a particular person. All who have died since the last feast was held and have not yet been honoured by such a celebration are remembered at this time. Hence the number of persons commemorated may be great, especially if many years have elapsed since the last commemoration service. The preparations last many weeks. Food and drink and all other necessaries are stowed in plenty, and the whole neighbourhood for miles round is invited to attend. On the eve of the feast, the women take bamboo splints and fashion out of them little models of various useful articles, and these models are hung over the graves for the use of the dead in the other world. If the feast is held in honour of a man, the things manufactured in his behoof will take the form of a bamboo gun, a shield, a war cap, and so on. If it is a woman who is commemorated, little models of a loom, a fish basket, a winnowing fan, and such like will be provided for her spirit. And if it is a child for whom the rite is performed, toys of various kinds will be made ready for the childish ghost. Finally, to stay the appetite of ghosts who may be too sharp-set to wait for the formal banquet in the house, a supply of victuals is very considerately placed outside the house on which the hungry spirits may fall to without delay. The dead arrive in a boat from the other world, for living Dyaks generally travel by river, for which it necessarily follows that Dyak ghosts do so likewise. The ship in which the ghostly visitors voyage to the land of the living is not much to look at, being in appearance nothing but a tiny boat made out of a bamboo which has been used to cook rice. Even this is not set floating in the river, but is simply thrown away under the house. Yet through the incantations uttered by the professional whaling woman, the bark is wafted away to the spirit world and is there converted into a large war canoe. Gladly the ghosts embark and sail away as soon as the final summons comes. It always comes in the evening, for it is then that the whaler begins to croon her mournful ditties, but the way is so long that the spirits do not arrive in the house till the day is breaking. To refresh them after their weary journey, a bamboo full of rice spirit awaits them, and this they partake of by deputy, for a brave old man who does not fear the face of ghosts quaffs a beverage in their stead amid the joyful shouts of the spectators. In the morning after the feast, the living pay the last offices of respect to the dead. Monuments made of ironwood, the little bamboo articles, and food of all kinds are set upon the graves. In consideration of these gifts, the ghosts now relinquish all claims on their surviving relatives, and henceforth earn their own living by the sweat of their brow. Before they take their final departure, they come to eat and drink in the house for the last time. Annual Festival of the Dead among the Nagas of Manipur. Thus the Dyak Festival of the Dead is not an annual welcome accorded to all the souls of ancestors. It is a propitiatory ceremony designed to secure once for all the eternal welfare of the recently departed, or at least to prevent their ghosts from returning to infest and importune the living. The same is perhaps the intention of the soul departure, Kathi Kasham festival, which the Tangal Nagas of Manipur in Assam celebrate every year about the end of January. At this great feast, the dead are represented by living men, chosen on the ground of their likeness to the departed, who are decked with ornaments and treated as if they were in truth the deceased persons come to life again. In that character, they dance together in the large open space of the village. They are fed by the female relations, and they go from house to house receiving presents of cloth. The festival lasts 10 days, but the great day is the 9th. Huge torches of pine wood are made ready to be used that evening when darkness has fallen. The time of departure of the dead is at hand. Their living representatives are treated to a last meal in their houses, and they distribute farewell presents to the sorrowing kinsfolk who have come to bid them goodbye. When the sun is set, a procession is formed. At the head of it march men holding aloft the flaring, sputtering torches. Then follow the elders armed in a martial array, and behind them stalk the representatives of the dead, with the relations of the departed crowding and trooping about them. Slowly and mournfully the sad procession moves, with loud lamentations, through the darkness to a spot at the north end of the village which is overshadowed by a great tree. The light of the torches is to guide the souls of the dead to their place of rest. The warlike array of the elders is to guard them from the perils and dangers of the way. At the village boundary, the procession stops and the torchbearers throw down their torches. At the same moment, the spirits of the dead are believed to pass into the dying flambeau, and in that guise to depart to the far country. There is therefore no further need for their living representatives, who are accordingly stripped of all their finery on the spot. When the people return home, each family is careful to light a pine torch and set it burning on a stone in the house just inside the front door. This they do as a precaution to prevent their own souls from following the spirits of the dead to the other world. The expense of thus dispatching the dead to their long home is very great. When the head of the family dies, debts may be incurred and rice fields and houses sold to defray the cost of carriage. Thus the living impoverish themselves in order to enrich the dead. Annual Festival of the Dead among the Oreons of Bengal. The Oreons or Ureons of Bengal feast their dead every year on a day in January. This ceremony is called the Great Marriage because by it the bones of the deceased are believed to be mysteriously reunited to each other. The Oreons treat the bones of the dead differently according to the dates of their death in the agricultural year. The bones of those who died before the seeds have sprouted in the fields are burnt, and the few charred bones, which have not been reduced to ashes, are gathered in an earthen pot. With the bones in the pot are placed offerings of rice, native gin and money, and then they carry the urn to the river where the bones of their forefathers repose. But the bones of all who die after the seeds have sprung up and before the end of harvest may not be taken to the river, because the people believe that were that to be done, the crops would suffer. These bones are therefore put away in a pot under a stone near the house till the harvest is over. Then on the appointed day in January, they are all collected. A banquet is given in honour of the dead, and then both men and women form a procession to accompany the bones of their last resting place in the sands of the river. But first the relics of mortality are carried from house to house in the village, and each family pours rice and gin into the urn, which contains the bones of its dead. Then the procession sets out for the river, men and women dancing, singing, beating drums and weeping, while the earthen pots containing the bones are passed from hand to hand and dance with the jiggling steps of the dancers. When they are yet some way from the spot, the bearers of the urns run forward and bury them in the sand of the river. When the rest come up, they will bathe, and the great marriage is over. Annual Festival of the Dead in Bilaspur. In the Bilaspur district of the Central Provinces, India, the festival known as the Fortnight of the Mains, Pitr Pak, occurs about September. It is believed that during this fortnight it is the practice of all the departed to come and visit their relatives. The homes are therefore cleaned, and the spaces in front of the house are plastered and painted in order to be pleasing to those who are expected. It is believed that the departed will return on the very date on which they went away. A father who left on the 4th, be it the 4th of the dark half or the light half of the moon, will return to visit his family on the 4th of the fortnight of the mains. On that day cakes are prepared, and with certain ceremony these are offered to the unseen hovering spirit. Their implicit belief is that the spirit will partake of the essence of the food, and that which remains, the material portion, may be eaten by members of the family. The souls of women, it is said, will all come on the 9th of the fortnight. On the 13th come those who have met with a violent death and who lost their lives by a fall, by snakebite or any other unusual cause. During the 4th night of the mains, a woman is not supposed to put on new bangles and a man is not permitted to shave. In short, this is a season of sad remembrances, an annual festival for the departed. Annual Festival of the Dead among the Bugis and Hakamis. The Bugis, a Karen tribe of Burma, hold an annual festival for the dead at the new moon, which falls near the end of August or the beginning of September. All the villagers who have lost relatives within the last 3 years take part in it. Food and drink is set out on tables for the ghosts, and new clothes for them are hung up in the room. All being ready, the people beat gongs and begin to weep. Each one calls upon the relation whom he has lost to come and eat. When the dead are thought to have arrived, the living address them, saying, You have come to me, you have returned to me. It has been raining hard, and you must be wet. Dress yourselves, clothe yourselves with these new garments and all the companions that are with you. Eat battle together with all that accompany you, all your friends and associates are the long dead. Call them all to eat and drink. The ghosts having finished their repast, the people dry their tears and sit down to eat what is left. More food is then prepared and put into a basket, and at cockcrow next morning the contents of the basket are thrown out of the house, while the living weep and call upon their dead as before. The Hakamis, a hill tribe of North Arakan, hold an important festival every year in honor of the departed spirits. It falls after harvest and is called the opening of the House of the Dead. When a person dies and has been burnt, the ashes are collected and placed in a small house in the forest together with his spear or gun, which has first been broken. These little huts are generally arranged in groups near a village and are sometimes large enough to be mistaken for one. After harvest, all the relations of the deceased cook various kinds of food and take them with pots of liquor distilled from rice to the village of the dead. There they open the doors of the houses. Having placed the food and drink inside, they shut them again. After that they weep, eat, drink, and return home. Annual Festival of the Dead in Cambodia. The Great Festival of the Dead in Cambodia takes place on the last day of the month, Phatrabot, September-October. But ever since the moon began to wane, everybody has been busy preparing for it. In every house, cakes and sweetmeats are set out, candles burn, incense sticks smoke, and the whole is offered to the ancestral shades with the invocation which is thrice repeated. O all you, our ancestors who are departed, deign to come and eat what we have prepared for you, and to bless your posterity and make it happy. 15 days afterwards, many little boats are made of bark and filled with rice, cakes, small coins, smoking incense sticks, and lighted candles. At evening, these are set floating on the river, and the souls of the dead embark in them to return to their own place. The living now bid them farewell. Go to the lands, I say, go to the fields you inhabit, to the mountains, under the stones which are your abodes. Go away, return. In due time your sons and your grandsons will think of you. Then you will return, you will return, you will return. The river is now covered with twinkling points of fire. But the current soon bears them away, and as they vanish one by one in the darkness, the souls depart with them to the far country. Annual Festival of the Dead in Tonquin. In Tonquin, as in Samba, the dead revisit their kinsfolk and their old homes at the new year. From the hour of midnight when the new year begins, no one dares to shut the door of his house for fear of excluding the ghosts who begin to arrive at that time. Preparations be made to welcome and refresh them after their long journey. Beds and mats are ready for their weary bodies to repose upon, water to wash their dusty feet, slippers to comfort them, and canes to support their feeble steps. Candles burn on the domestic altar, and pastilles diffuse a fragrant odour. The people bow before the unseen visitors and beseech them to remember and bless their descendants in the coming year. Having discharged this pious duty, they abstain from sweeping the house for 3 days, lest the dust should incommode the ghosts. Annual Festival of the Dead in Annam. In Annam, one of the most important festivals of the year is the Festival of Tet, which falls on the first 3 days of the new year. It is devoted to the worship of ancestors. Everybody, even the poorest, must provide a good meal for the souls of his dead at this time, and must himself eat and drink heartily. Some families, in order to discharge this pious duty, run into debt for the whole year. In the houses, everything is put in order, washed and scoured for the reception of the dear and distinguished guests. A tall bamboo pole is set up in the front of every house and allowed to stand there for 7 days. A small basket containing areca, betel, and leaves of gilt paper is fastened to the pole. The erection of the pole is a sacred rite which no family omits to perform, though why they do so few people can say. Some, however, allege that the posts are intended to guide the ancestral spirits to their old homes. The ceremony of the reception of the shades takes place at nightfall on the last day of the year. The house of the head of the family is then decked with flowers, and in the room which serves as a domestic chapel, the altar of the ancestors is surrounded with flowers, among which the lotus, the emblem of immortality, is most conspicuous. On a table are set red candles, perfumes, incense, sandalwood, and plates full of bananas, oranges, and other fruits. The relations crouch before the altar, and kneeling at the door of it, the head of the house invokes the name of the family which he represents. Then in solemn tones, he recites an incantation, mentioning the names of his most illustrious ancestors, and marking time with the strokes of a hammer upon a gong, while crackers are exploded outside the room. After that, he implores the ancestral shades to protect the descendants and invites them to a repast, which is spread for them on a table. Round this table he walks, serving the invisible guests with his own hands. He distributes to them smoking balls of rice in little china saucers and pours tea or spirits into each little cup, while he murmurs words of invitation and compliment. When the ghosts have eaten and drunk their fill, the head of the family returns to the altar and salutes them for the last time. Finally he takes leave of yellow paper, covered with gold and silver spangles, and throws them into a brazier placed at the foot of the ancestral tablets. These papers represent imaginary bars of gold and silver, which the living send to the dead. Cardboard models of houses, furniture, jewels, clothes, of everything in short that the ghost can need in the other world, are dispatched to them in like manner in the flames. Then the family sits down to table and feasts on the remains of the ghostly banquet. Annual Festival of Friendless Ghosts in Annam. But in Annam, it is not merely the spirits of ancestors who are thus feasted and supplied with all the necessities of life. The poor ghosts of those who died without leaving descendants or whose bodies were left unburied are not forgotten by the pious Ammonites. But these spirits come round at a different time of year from the others. The 7th month of the year is set apart for expiatory sacrifices destined to benefit these unhappy beings, and that is why in Annam nobody should marry or be betrothed in that month. The great day of the month is the 15th, which is called the Festival of the Souls. On that day, the ghosts in question are set free by the Lord of the Underworld, and they come prowling about among the living. They are exceedingly dangerous, especially to children. Hence, in order to appease their wrath and prevent them from entering their houses, every family takes care to put out offerings for them in the street. Before every house on that night you may see candles lighted, paper garments of many colours, paper hats, paper boots, paper furniture, ingots of gold and silver paper, all hanging in tempting array from a string, while plates of food and cups of tea and rice spirit stand ready for the use of hungry and thirsty souls. The theory is that the ghosts will be so busy consuming the victuals, appropriating their deceitful riches, and trying on the paper coats, hats and boots, that they will have neither the leisure nor the inclination to intrude upon the domestic circle indoors. At 7 o'clock in the evening, fire is put to the offerings, and the paper wardrobe, furniture, and money soon vanish, crackling in the flames. At the same moment, peeping in at the door or window, you may see the domestic ancestral altar brilliantly illuminated. As for the food, it is supposed to be thrown on the fire or on the ground for the use of the ghosts, but practically it is eaten by vagabonds and beggars who scuffle for the booty. Annual festivals of the dead in Cochinchina, Siam, and Japan. In Cochinchina, the ancestral spirits are similarly propitiated and fed on the first day of the new year. The tablets which represent them are placed on the domestic altar, and the family prostrate themselves before these emblems of the departed. The head of the family lights sticks of incense on the altar and prays the shades of his forefathers to accept the offerings and be favourable to their descendants. With great gravity he waits upon the ghosts, passing dishes of food before the ancestral tablets and pouring out wine and tea to slake the thirst of the spirits. When the dead are supposed to be satisfied with the shadowy essence of the food, the living partake of its gross material substance. In Siam and Japan also, the souls of the dead revisit their families for 3 days in every year, and the lamps which the Japanese kindle in multitudes on that occasion to light the spirits of their way have procured for the festival the name of the Feast of the Lanterns. It is to be observed that in Siam, as in Tonquin and Sumba, the return of the ghosts take place at the new year. Annual festivals of the dead among the Chusers and Armenians. The Chusers of the Caucasus believe that the souls of the departed revisit their old homes on the Saturday night of the second week in Lent. This gathering of the dead is called the Assembly of Souls. The people spare no expense to treat the unseen guests handsomely. Beer is brewed and loaves of various shapes baked specially for the occasion. The Armenians celebrate the memory of the dead on many days of the year, burning incense and lighting tapers in their honour. One of their customs is to keep a light of the dead burning all night in the house in order that the ghosts may be able to enter. For if the spirits find the house dark, they spit down the chimney and depart, cursing their churlish inmates. Annual festivals of the dead in Africa. Early in April every year, the Dahomans of West Africa set a table, as they term it, and invite friends to eat with the deceased relatives whose spirits are supposed to move round and partake of the good things in this life. Even my interpreter, Madi K. Lemon, who pretends to despise the belief in fetish, sets a table to his ancestors and will tell you that his grand or great-grandfather, Corporal Lemon, makes a meal on this occasion which will last him till the next annual feast. The Berea, and apparently the Kunama, two Ethan tribes who lead a settled agricultural life to the north of Abyssinia, celebrate every year a festival in the month of November. It is a festival of thanksgiving for the completion of the harvest, and at the same time a commemoration and propitiation of the dead. Every house prepares much beer for the occasion, and a small pot of beer is set out for each deceased member of the household. After standing for 2 days in the house, the beer which was devoted to the dead is drunk by the living. At these festivals, all the people of the district meet in a special place, and there pass the time in games and dances. Among the Berea, the festive gatherings are held in a sacred grove. We are told that he who owes another a drubbing on this day can pay his debt with impunity, for it is a day of peace when all feuds are in abeyance. Wild honey may not be gathered till the festival has been held. Apparently the festival is a sort of Saturnalia, such as is celebrated elsewhere at the end of harvest. At that season there is food and to spare for the dead as well as the living. Annual festivals of the dead among peoples of the Aryan stock. Among peoples of the Aryan stock, so far back as we can trace their history, the worship and propitiation of the dead seem to have formed a principal element of the popular religion. And like so many other races, they appear to have believed that once a year the souls of their departed kinsfolk revisited their old homes and expected to be refreshed with abundance of good cheer by their surviving relations. This belief gave rise to the custom of celebrating an annual feast of All Souls, which has come down to us from a dateless antiquity and is still observed year by year with the rites of primitive simplicity in some parts of Europe. Annual Festival of the Dead, the fraizer, among the old Iranians. Such a festival was held every year in spring by the old Iranians. The celebration fell at the end of the year and lasted 10 days, namely the last 5 days of the last month and the 5 following supplementary days, which were regularly inserted to make up a year of 365 days. For the old Iranian, like the old Egyptian, year was a vague year of 12 months, of 30 days each, with 5 supplementary days added at the end for the sake of bringing it into apparent, though not real, harmony with the sun's annual course in the sky. According to one calculation, the 10 days of the festival corresponded to the last days of February, but according to another they fell in March. In later ages, the Parsees assigned the name of the festival was Hamaspathamantia. From a passage in the Zend Avesta, the ancient sacred book of the Iranians, we learn that on the 10 nights of the festival, the souls of the dead, the favishes, were believed to go about the village asking the people to do them revenge, to pray to them, to meditate on them, and to furnish them with meat and clothes, while at the same time they promised that blessings should rest on the pious householder who complied with their request. Annual Festival of the Dead among the Persians. The Arab geographer al-Biruni, who flourished about the year 1000 of our era, tells us that among the Persians of his time, the last 5 days of the month Aban were called Farwadajan. The Arab geographer al-Biruni, who flourished about the year 1000 of our era, tells us that among the Persians of his time, the last 5 days of the month Aban were called Farwadajan. During this time, he says, people put food in the halls of the dead and drink on the roofs of the houses, believing that the spirits of their dead during these days come out from their places of their rewards to their punishment, that they go to the dishes laid out for them, imbibe their strength, and suck their taste. They fumigate their houses with juniper, that the dead may enjoy its smell. The spirits of the pious men dwell among their families, children, and relations, and occupy themselves with their affairs, although invisible to them. He adds that there was a controversy among the Persians as to the date of this festival of the dead, some maintaining that the 5 days during which it lasted were the last 5 days of the month Aban, whereas others held that they were the 5 supplementary days which were inserted between the months of Aban and Adhar. The dispute, he continues, was settled by the adoption of all 10 days for the celebration of the feast. Feast of All Souls in Brittany and other parts of France. Similar beliefs as to the annual return of the dead survive to this day in many parts of Europe and find expression in similar customs. The Day of the Dead, or of All Souls as we call it, is commonly the 2nd of November. Thus in Lower Brittany, the souls of the departed come to visit the living on the eve of that day. After Vespers are over, the priests and choir walk in procession, the procession of the charnel house, chanting a weird dirge in the Breton tongue. Then the people go home, gather round the fire, and talk with the departed. The housewife covers the kitchen table with a white cloth, sets out cider, curds, and hot pancakes on it, and retires with the family to rest. The fire on the hearth is kept up by a huge log known as the Log of the Dead, Kef an-Nanun. Soon, doleful voices outside in the darkness break the stillness of night. It is the singers of death who go about the streets, waking the sleepers by a wild and melancholy song, in which they remind the living of their comfortable beds to pray for the poor souls in pain. All that night the dead warm themselves at the hearth and feast on the viands prepared for them. Sometimes you will struck listeners hear the stools creaking in the kitchen, or the dead leaves outside rustling under the ghostly footsteps. In the Vosges Mountains on All Souls' Eve, the solemn sound of the church bells invite good Christians to pray for the repose of the dead. While the bells are ringing, it is customary in some families to uncover the beds and open the windows, doubtless in order to let the poor souls enter them rest. No one that evening would dare to remain deaf to the appeal of the bells. The prayers are prolonged to a late hour of the night. When the last De Profundis has been uttered, the head of the family gently covers up the beds, sprinkles them with holy water, and shuts the windows. In some villages, fire is kept up on the hearth and a basket of nuts is placed beside it for the use of the ghosts. Again, in some parts of Sientong and Adonis, a mass candle used to be lit before the domestic crucifix on All Souls' Day at the very hour when the last member of the family departed this life. And some people, just as in Tonquin, refrains from sweeping the house that day lest they should thereby disturb the ghostly visitors. Feast of All Souls in Belgium. In Bruges, Dinant, and other towns of Belgium, holy candles burn all night in the houses on the eve of All Souls, and the bells toll till midnight or even till morning. People too often set lighted candles on the graves. At Scherpenheuvel, the houses are illuminated, and the people walk in procession carrying lighted candles in their hands. A very common custom in Belgium is to eat soul cakes or soul bread on the eve or the day of All Souls. The eating of them is believed to benefit the dead in some way. Perhaps originally, as among the Eskimos of Alaska to this day, the ghosts were thought to enter into the bodies of the relatives and so to share the victuals which the survivors consumed. Similarly, at festivals in honour of the dead in northern India, it is customary to feed Brahmans, and the flood which these holy men partake of is believed to pass to the deceased and to refresh their languid spirits. The same idea of eating and drinking by proxy may perhaps partly explain many other funeral feasts. Be that as it may, at Dixmude, and elsewhere in Belgium, they said that you deliver a soul from purgatory for every cake you eat. At Antwerp, they give a local colour to the soul cakes by baking them with plenty of saffron, the deep yellow tinge being suggestive of the flames of purgatory. People in Antwerp at the same season are careful not to slam doors or windows for fear of hurting the ghosts. Feast of All Souls in Lechrain. In Lechrain, a district of southern Bavaria, which extends along the valley of the Lech from its source to near the point where the river flows into the Danube, the two festivals of All Saints and All Souls, on the 1st and 2nd of November, have significantly fused in popular usage into a single festival of the dead. In fact, the people pay little or no heed to the saints and give all their thoughts to the souls of their departed kinsfolk. The Feast of All Souls begins immediately after Vespers and All Saints' Day. Even on the eve of All Saints' Day, that is, on the 31st of October, which we call Halloween, the graveyard is cleaned and every grave adorned. The decoration consists in weeding the mounds, sprinkling a layer of charcoal on the bare earth, and marking up patterns on it in red service berries. The marigold, too, is still in bloom at that season in cottage gardens, and garlands of its orange blooms, mingled with other late flowers left by the departing summer, are twinned about the grey moss-grown tombstones. The basin of holy water is filled with fresh water, and a branch of boxwood put into it, for boxwood in the popular mind is associated with death and the dead. On the eve of All Souls' Day, the people begin to visit the graves and to offer the soul cakes to the hungry souls. Next morning before 8 o'clock commence the vigil, the requiem, and the solemn visitation of the graves. On that day, every household offers a plate of meal, oats, and spelt on a side altar in the church, while in the middle of the sacred edifice a bier is set, covered with a pall, and surrounded by lighted tapers and vessels of holy water. The tapers burnt on that day, and indeed generally in services for the departed are read. In the evening people go, whenever they can do so, to their native village, where their dear ones lie in the churchyard, and there at the graves they pray for the poor souls and leave an offering of soul cakes also on a side altar in the church. The soul cakes are baked of dough in the shape of a coil of hair and are made of all sizes up to 3 feet long. They form a prerequisite of the sexton. Soul cakes in All Souls' Day in southern Germany. The custom of baking soul cakes, sometimes called simply souls on All Souls' Day, is widespread in southern Germany and Austria. Everywhere, we may assume, the cakes were originally intended for the benefit of the hungry dead, though they are often eaten by the living. In the Upper Palatinate, people throw food into the fire on All Souls' Day for the poor souls, set lights on the table for them, and pray on bended knees for their repose. On the graves, too, lights are kindled, vessels of holy water placed, and food deposited for the refreshment of the souls. All over the Upper Palatinate on All Souls' Day, it is also customary to bake special cakes of fine bread and distribute them to the poor, who eat them perhaps as the deputies of the dead. Feast of All Souls in Bohemia. The Germans of Bohemia observe All Souls' Day with much solemnity. Each family celebrates the memory of the dead. On the eve of the day, it is customary to eat cakes and to drink cold milk for the purpose of cooling the poor souls who are roasting in purgatory, from which it appears that spirits feel the soothing effect of victuals consumed vicariously by their friends on earth. The ringing of the church bells to prayer on that evening is believed to be the signal which the ghosts, released from the infernal jail, come trooping to the old familiar fireside, there to rest from their pangs for a single night. In so many places people fill a lamp with butter, light it, and set it on the hearth, that with the butter the poor ghosts may adorn the burns they have received from the sulphureous and tormenting flames of purgatory. Next morning the chime of the church bells, ringing at early mass, is the knell that birds and souls return to their place of pain, but such as have completed their penance take flight to heaven. So on the eve of All Saints' Day, each family gathers in the parlour or the kitchen, speaks softly of those they have lost, recalls what they said and did in life, and prays for the repose of their souls. While the prayer is being said, the children kindle little wax lights which have been specially bought for the purpose that day. Next morning the families go to church, where mass is celebrated for the dead. Then they wend their way to the churchyard, where they deck the graves of their kinsfolk with flowers and wreaths and set little lights upon them. This custom of illuminating the graves and decking them with flowers on the eve or day of All Souls is common all over Bohemia. It is observed in Prague as well as in the country, by Czechs as well as by Germans. In some Czech villages, 4 cornered cakes of a special sort, baked of white wheaten meal with milk, are eaten on All Souls' Day or given to beggars that they may pray for the dead. Among the Germans of Western Bohemia, poor children go from house to house on All Souls' Day, begging for soul cakes, and when they receive them they pray God to bless all poor souls. In the southern districts, every farmer used to grind a great quantity of corn against the day and to bake it into 500 or 600 little black soul cakes, which he gave away to the poor who came begging for them. Feast of All Souls in Moravia. All Souls' Day is celebrated with similar rites by the Germans of Moravia. The festival of the farewell to summer, says a German writer on this subject, was held by our heathen forefathers in the beginning of November, and with the memory of the departed summer, they united the memory of the departed souls, and this last has survived in the Feast of All Souls, which is everywhere observed with great piety. On the evening of All Souls, the relations of the departed assemble in the churchyard and adorn the graves of their dear ones with flowers and lights, while the children kindle little wax tapers, which have been bought for them to light the poor souls. According to the popular belief, they did go in procession to the church about midnight, and any stout-hearted young man can there see all the living men who will die within the year. Feast of All Souls in the Tyrol. In the Tyrol, the belief and customs are similar. There too, soul lights, that is, lamps filled with lard or butter, are lighted and placed on the hearth on All Souls' Eve, in order that poor souls, escaped from the fires of purgatory, may smear the melted grease on their burns, and so alleviate their pangs. Some people also leave milk and donuts for them on the table all night. The graves also are illuminated with wax candles and decked with such a profusion of flowers that you might think it was springtime. In the Italian Tyrol, it is customary to give bread or money to the poor on All Souls' Day. In the Val di Ledro, children threaten to dirty the doors of houses if they do not get the usual dole. Some rich people treat the poor to bean soup on that day. Others put pitchers full of water in the kitchen on All Souls' night, that the poor souls might slake their thirst. Feast of All Souls in Baden. In Baden it is still customary to deck the graves with flowers and lights on All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. The lights are sometimes kindled in hollowed turnips, on the sides of which inscriptions are carved and shine out in the darkness. If any child steals a turnip lantern or anything else from a grave, the indignant ghost who has been robbed appears to the thief the same night and reclaims his stolen property. A relic of the old custom of feeding the dead survives in the practice of giving soul cakes to godchildren. Annual festivals of the dead among the Lets and Samogitians. The Lets used to entertain and feed the souls of the dead for 4 weeks from Michaelmas, September 29, to the day of St. Simon and St. Jude, October 28. They call the season Welelek, or Semlika, and regarded it as so holy that while it lasted they would not willingly thresh the corn, alleging that grain threshed at that time would be useless for sowing, since the souls of the dead would not allow it to sprout. But we must suspect that the original motive of the absence was a fear lest the blows of the flails should fall upon the poor ghosts swarming in the air. At this season the people were wont to prepare food of all sorts for the spirits and set it on the floor of a room, which had been well heated and swept for the purpose. Late in the evening, the master of the house went into the room, tended the fire, and called upon his dead kinsfolk by their names to come and eat and drink. If he saw the ghosts, he would die within the year, but if he did not see them, he would outlive it. When he thought the souls had eaten and drunk enough, he took the staff which serves as a poker and laid on the threshold, cut it in two with an axe. At the same time he bade the spirits go their way, charging them to keep to the roads and paths, and not to tread upon the rye. If the crops turned out ill next year, the people laid the failure at the door of the ghosts who fancied themselves scurvily treated and had taken their revenge by trampling down the corn. The Samagitians annually invited the dead to come from their graves and enjoy a bath and a feast. For their entertainment, they prepared a special hut in which they set out food and drink, together with a seat and a napkin for every soul who had been invited. They left the souls to revel by themselves for 3 days in the hut. Then they deposited the remains of the banquet on the graves and bade the ghosts farewell. The good things, however, were usually consumed by charcoal burners in the forest. This feast of the dead fell early in November. The Estonians prepare a meal for their dead on All Souls' Day, the 2nd of November, and invite them by their names to come and partake of it. The ghosts arrive in the early morning at the first cock crow and depart at the second, being ceremoniously lighted out of the house by the head of the family, who waves a white cloth at them and bids them come again next year. Festival of the Dead in Russia. In some parts of the Russian government of Olonets, the inhabitants of a village sometimes celebrate a joint festival in honor of all the dead. Having chosen a house for the purpose, they spread 3 tables, one outside the front door, one in the passage, and one in the room which is heated by a stove. Then they go out to meet their unseen guests and usher them into their house with these words: "Ye are tired, our own ones, take something to eat." The ghosts accordingly refresh themselves at each table in succession. Then the master of the house bids them warm themselves at the stove, remarking that they must have grown cold in the damp earth. After that, the living guests sit down to eat at the tables. Towards the end of the meal, the host opens the window and lets the ghosts gently out of it by means of the shroud in which they were lowered into the grave. As they slide down it from the warm room into the outer air, the people tell them, "Now it is time for you to go home, and your feet must be tired. The way is not a little one for you to travel. Here is softer for you. Now in God's name, farewell." Annual festivals of the dead among the Vodyaks of Russia. Among the Vodyaks of Russia, every family sacrifices to its dead once a year in the week before Palm Sunday. The sacrifice is offered in the house about midnight. Flesh, bread or cakes and beer are set on the table, and on the floor beside the table stands a trough of bark with a lighted wax candle stuck on the rim. The master of the house, having covered his head with his hat, takes a piece of meat in his hand and says, "Ye spirits long departed, guard and preserve us well. Make none of us cripplers. Send no plagues upon us. Cause the corn, the wine, and the food to prosper with us." The Vodyaks of the government of Ujatka and Kasan celebrate 2 memorial festivals of the dead every year, one in autumn and the other in spring. On a certain day, kormis is distilled, beer brewed, and potato scones baked in every house. All the members of a clan who trace their descent through women from one mythical ancestress assemble in a single house, generally in one which lies at the boundary of the clan land. Here an old man moulds wax candles, and when the requisite number is made, he sticks them on the shelf of the stove and begins to mention the dead relations of the master of the house by name. For each of them he crumbles a piece of bread, gives each of them a piece of pancake, pours kormis and beer, and puts a spoonful of soup into the trough made for the purpose. All persons present whose parents are dead follow his example. The dogs are then allowed to eat out of the trough. If they eat quietly, it is a sign that the dead live in peace. If they do not eat quietly, it argues the contrary. Then the company sit down to the table and partake of the meal. Next morning, both the dead and the living refresh themselves with a drink, and a fowl is boiled. The proceedings are the same as on the evening before, but now they treat the souls for the last time as a preparation for their journey, saying, "Eat, drink, and go home to your companions. Live at peace, be gracious to us, keep our children, guard our corn, our beasts and birds." Then the people banquet and indulge in all sorts of improprieties. The women refrain from feasting until the dead have taken their departure, but when the souls are gone, there is no longer any motive for abstinence. The kormis circulates freely among the women, and they grow wanton. Yet at this, as at every other festival, the men and women eat in different parts of the room. Feast of All Souls in the Abruzzi. On All Saints' Day, the 1st of November, shops and streets in the Abruzzi are filled with candles, which people buy in order to kindle them in the evening on the graves of their relations. For all the dead come to visit their homes at night, the eve of All Souls, and they need lights to show them the way. For their use too, lights are kept burning in their houses all night. Before people go to sleep, they place on the table a lighted lamp or candle and a frugal meal of bread and water. The dead issue from their graves and stalk in procession through every street of the village. You can see them if you stand at a crossroad with your chin resting on a forked stick. First pass the souls of the good, and then the souls of the murdered and the damned. Once, they say, a man was thus peeping at the ghostly procession. The good souls told him he had better go home, and when he saw the tail of the procession, he died of fright. Soul cakes on All Souls' Day in England. In our own country, the old belief in the annual return of the dead long lingered in the custom of baking soul cakes, eating them or distributing them to the poor on All Souls' Day. Peasant girls used to go from farmhouse to farmhouse on that day singing, "Soul, soul for a soul cake. Pray you, good mistress, a soul cake." In Shropshire, down to the 17th century, it was customary on All Souls' Day to set on the table a high heap of soul cakes, and most visitors to the house took one of them. The antiquary John Aubrey, who records the custom, mentions also the appropriate verses. A soul cake, have mercy on all Christian souls for a soul cake. Souling Day in Shropshire. Indeed, the custom of soul cakes survived in Shropshire down to the later part of the 19th century, and may not be extinct even now. With us, All Saints' Day is known as Souling Day, and up to the present time in many places, poor children and sometimes men go out souling, which means that they go round to the house of all the more well-to-do people within reach, reciting a ditty peculiar to the day, and looking for a dole of cakes, broken victuals, ale, apples or money. The two latter are now the usual rewards, but there are few old North Salupians who cannot remember when soul cakes were made at all the farms and bettermost houses in readiness for the day, and were given to all who came for them. We are told of liberal housewives who would provide as many as a clothes basket full. The same custom as going out a souling on All Saints' Day or All Souls' Day used to be observed in the neighbouring counties of Staffordshire, Cheshire, Lancashire, Herefordshire and Monmouthshire. In Herefordshire, the soul cakes were made of oatmeal, and he or she who received one of them was bound to say to the giver, "God have your soul, beans and all." Thus the practice of souling appears to have prevailed especially in the English counties which border on Wales. In many parts of Wales itself, down to the first half of the 19th century, poor peasants used to go about begging for bread on All Souls' Day. The bread bestowed on them was called backround or dole bread. This custom was a survival of the Middle Ages, when the poor begged bread for the souls of their departed relatives and friends. However, the custom was not confined to the west of England, for at Whitby in Yorkshire, down to the early part of the 19th century, it was usual to make soul mass loaves on or about All Souls' Day. They were small round loaves sold by bakers at a farthing apiece, chiefly for peasants to children. In former times, people used to keep one or two of them for good luck. In Aberdeenshire also, on All Souls' Day, baked cakes of a particular sort are given away to those who may chance to visit the house where they are made. The cakes are called doge loaf. Even in the remote island of St Kilda, it was customary on All Saints' Day to bake a large cake in the form of a triangle, furrowed round. The cake must be all eaten that night. Feast of All Souls among the Indians of Ecuador. The same mode of celebrating All Souls' Day has been transported by Catholicism to the New World and imparted to the Aborigines of that continent. Thus in Cachi, a province of Ecuador, the Indians prepare foods of various sorts against All Souls' Day, and when the day has come, they take some of the provisions to the church and there deposit them on tables set out for the purpose. These good things are the prerequisite of the priest, who celebrates Mass for the dead. After the service, the Indians repair to the cemetery, where, with burning candles and pots of holy water, they prostrate themselves before the tombs of their relations, while the priest or the sacristan recites prayers for the souls that departed. In the evening, the Indians return to their houses. A table with 4 lights on it is spread with food and drink, especially with such things as the dead loved in their life. The door is left open all night, no doubt to let the spirits of the dead enter, and the family sits up, keeping the invisible guests company through the long hours of darkness. From 7 o'clock and onwards, troops of children traverse the village and its neighborhood. They go from house to house, ringing a bell and crying, "We are angels, we descend from the sky, we ask for bread." The people go to their doors and beg the children to recite a Pater Noster and an Ave Maria for the dead whom they name. When the prayer has been duly said, they give the children a little of the food from the table. All night long this goes on, band succeeding band of children. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the family consumes the remainder of the food of the souls. Here the children going from door to door during the night of All Souls appear to personate the souls of the dead who are also abroad at that time. Hence, to give bread to the children is the same thing as to give bread to the poor hungry souls. Probably the same explanation applies to the giving of soul cakes to children and to the poor on All Souls' Day in Europe. The nominally Christian feast of All Souls on November the 2nd appears to be an old Celtic festival of the dead adopted by the Church in 998 AD. A comparison of these European customs with the similar heathen rites can leave no room for doubt that the nominally Christian feast of All Souls is nothing but an old pagan festival of the dead which the Church, unable or unwilling to suppress, resolved, from motives of policy, to connive at. But whence did it borrow the practice of solemnizing the festival on that particular day, the 2nd of November? In order to answer this question, we should observe, first, that celebrations of this sort are often held at the beginning of a new year, and second, that the peoples of northwestern Europe, the Celts and the Teutons, appear to have dated the beginning of their year from the beginning of winter, the Celts reckoning it from the 1st of November, and the Teutons from the 1st of October. The difference of reckoning may be due to a difference of climate, the home of the Teutons in Central and Northern Europe being a region where winter sets in earlier than on the more temperate and humid coasts of the Atlantic, the home of the Celts. These considerations suggest that the Festival of All Souls on the 2nd of November originated with the Celts and spread from them to the rest of the European peoples, who, while they preserved their old feasts of the dead practically unchanged, may have transferred them to the 2nd of November. This conjecture is supported by what we know of the ecclesiastical institution, or rather recognition of the festival, for that recognition was first accorded at the end of the 10th century in France, a Celtic country, from which the church festival gradually spread over Europe. Institution of the Feast of All Souls by the Abbot of Clugny. It was Odilo, abbot of the great Benedictine monastery of Clugny, who initiated the change in 998 AD by ordering that all in the monasteries over which he ruled a solemn mass should be celebrated on the 2nd of November for all the dead who sleep in Christ. The example thus set was followed by other religious houses, and the bishops, one after another, introduced the new celebration into their dioceses. Thus the Festival of All Souls gradually established itself throughout Christendom, though in fact the Church has never formally sanctioned it by general edict nor attached much weight to its observance. Indeed, when objections were raised to the festival at the Reformation, the ecclesiastical authorities seemed ready to abandon it. These facts are explained very simply by the theory that an old Celtic commemoration of the dead lingered in France down to the end of the 10th century, and was then, as a measure of policy and a concession to ineradicable paganism, at last incorporated in the Catholic ritual. The consciousness of the heathen origin of the practice would naturally prevent the supreme authorities from insisting strongly on its observance. They appear rightly to have regarded it as an outpost which they could surrender to the forces of rationalism without endangering the citadel of the faith. The Feast of All Saints on November the 1st seems also to have displaced a heathen festival of the dead. Perhaps we may go a step further and explain in like manner the origin of the Feast of All Saints on the 1st of November. For the analogy of similar customs elsewhere will lead us to suppose that the old Celtic Festival of the Dead was held on the Celtic New Year's Day, that is, on the 1st, not the 2nd of November. May not then the institution of the Feast of All Saints on that day have been the first attempt of the Church to give a colour of Christianity to the ancient heathen rite by substituting the saints for the souls of the dead as a true object of worship? The fact of history seems to countenance this hypothesis, for the Feast of All Saints was instituted in France and Germany by order of the Emperor by Louis the Pious in 835 AD. That is, about 160 years before the introduction of the Feast of All Souls. The innovation was made by the advice of the Pope Gregory IV, whose motive may well have been that of suppressing an old pagan custom which was still notoriously practiced in France and Germany. The idea, however, was not a novel one, for the testimony of Bede proves that in Britain, another Celtic country, the Feast of All Saints on the 1st of November was already celebrated in the 8th century. We may conjecture that this attempt to divert the devotion of the faithful from the souls of the dead to the saints proved a failure, and that finally the Church reluctantly decided to sanction the popular superstition by frankly omitting a Feast of All Souls into their calendar. But it could not assign the new, or rather the old festival, to the old day, the 1st of November, since that was already occupied by the Feast of All Saints. Accordingly, it placed the Mass for the dead on the next day, the 2nd of November. On this theory, the Feast of All Saints and of All Souls mark two successive efforts of the Catholic Church to eradicate an old heathen festival of the dead. Both efforts failed. In all Catholic countries, the Day of All Souls has preserved the serious character of the festival of the dead, which no worldly gaiety are allowed to disturb. It is then the sacred duty of the survivors to visit the graves of their loved ones in the churchyard, to deck them with flowers and lights, and to utter a devout prayer, a pious custom with which in cities like Paris and Vienna, even the gay and frivolous comply for the sake of appearance, if not to satisfy impulse of the heart. End of Section 4. Section 5 of The Golden Bough, A Study of Magic and Religion, Part 4, Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Volume 2, by Sir James George Frazer. Chapter 4, The Official Festivals of Osiris, Part 2. Part 3, The Festival in the Month of 8th Year. Festival of the Dead and Resurrection of Osiris in the month of 8th year. The foregoing evidence leads some support to the conjecture, for it is only a conjecture, that the great festival of Osiris at Sais, with its accompanying illumination of the houses, was a night of All Souls, when the ghosts of the dead swarmed in the streets and revisited their old homes, which were lit up to welcome them back again. Herodotus, who briefly describes the festival, omits to mention its date, but we can determine it with some probability from other sources. Thus Plutarch tells us that Osiris was murdered on the 17th of the month of 8th year, and that the Egyptians accordingly observed mournful rites for 4 days from the 17th of 8th year. Now in the Alexandrian calendar, which Plutarch used, these 4 days corresponded to the 13th, 14th, 15th and 16th of November, and this date answers exactly to the other indications given by Plutarch, who says that at the time of the festival the Nile was sinking, the north winds dying away, the nights lengthening, and the leaves falling from the trees. During these 4 days, a gilt cowl swathed in a black pall was exhibited as an image of Isis. This, no doubt, was the image mentioned by Herodotus in his account of the festival. On the 19th day of the month, the people went down to the sea, the priest carrying a shrine which contained a golden casket. Into this casket they poured fresh water, and thereupon the spectators raised a shout that Osiris was found. The finding of Osiris. After that they took some vegetable mould, moistened it with water, mixed it with precious spices and incense, and moulded the paste into a small moon-shaped image, which was then robed and ornamented. Thus it appears that the purpose of the ceremonies described by Plutarch was to represent dramatically, first, the search for the dead body of Osiris, and second its joyful discovery, followed by the resurrection of the dead god who came to life again in the new image of vegetable mold and spices. Lactantius tells us how on these occasions the priests, with their shaven bodies, beat their breasts and lamented, imitating the sorrowful search of Isis for her lost son Osiris, and how afterwards their sorrow was turned to joy when the jackal-headed god Immerse, or rather a mummer in his stead, produced a small boy, the living representative of the god who was lost and was found. Thus, Lactantius regarded Osiris as a son instead of the husband of Isis, and he makes no mention of the image of vegetable mold. It is probable that the boy who figured in the sacred drama played the part, not of Osiris, but of his son Horus. But as the death and resurrection of the god was celebrated in many cities of Egypt, it is also possible that in some places the part of the god came to life was played by a living actor instead of by an image. Another Christian writer describes how the Egyptians, with shorn heads, annually lamented over a buried idol of Osiris, smiting their breasts, slashing their shoulders, ripping open their old wounds, until, after several days of mourning, they professed to find the mangled remains of the god, at which they rejoiced. However, the details of the ceremony may have varied in different places. The pretense of finding the god's body, and probably of restoring it to life, was a great event in the festal year of the Egyptians. The shouts of joy which greeted it are described or alluded to by many ancient writers. Part 4. The Festival in the Monk of Koyak. The great Osirian inscription at Dendera. The funeral rites of Osiris, as they were observed at this great festival in the 16 provinces of Egypt, are described in a long inscription of the Ptolemaic period, which is engraved on the walls of the god's temple at Dendera, the Tentira of the Greeks, a town of Upper Egypt situated on the western bank of the Nile, about 40 miles north of Thebes. Unfortunately, while the information thus furnished is remarkably full and minute on many points, the arrangement adopted in the inscription is so confused and the expression often so obscure that a clear and consistent account of the ceremonies as a whole can hardly be extracted from it. Moreover, we learn from the document that the ceremonies varied somewhat in the several cities, the ritual of Abydos, for example, differing from that of Osiris. Without attempting to trace all the particulars of local usage, I shall briefly indicate what seem to have been the leading features of the festival, so far as these can be ascertained with tolerable certainty. The rites of Osiris in the month of Koyak represented the god as dead, dismembered, and then reconstituted by the union of his scattered limbs. The rites lasted 18 days, from the 12th to the 13th of the month of Koyak, and set forth the nature of Osiris in his triple aspect as dead, dismembered, and finally reconstituted by the union of his scattered limbs. In the first of these aspects he was called Enchantment, Kentiamante, in the second Osiris Sep, and in the third Sokari, Seker. Small images of the god were moulded of sand or vegetable earth and corn, to which incense was sometimes added. His face was painted yellow and his cheekbones green. These images were cast in a mould of pure gold, which represented the god in the form of a mummy, with the white crown of Egypt on his head. The festival opened on the 12th day of Koyak with a ceremony of ploughing and sowing. 2 black cows were yoked to the plough, which is made of tamarisk wood, while the share was of black copper. A boy scattered the seed. One end of the field was sown with barley, the other with spelt, and the middle with flax. During the operation, the chief celebrant recited the ritual chapter of the sowing of the fields. At Osiris, on the 20th of Koyak, sand and barley were put in the god's garden, which appeared to have been a sort of large flower pot. This was done in the presence of the cow goddess Shinti, represented seemingly by the image of a cow made of gilt sycamore wood with a hairless human image in its inside. The fresh inundation water was poured out of a golden vase over both the goddess and the garden, and the barley was allowed to grow in the emblem of the resurrection of the god after his burial in the earth. For the growth of the garden is the growth of the divine substance. On the 22nd of Koyak, at the 8th hour, the images of Osiris, attended by 34 images of deities, performed a mysterious voyage in 34 tiny boats made of papyrus, which are illuminated by 365 lights. The burial of Osiris. On the 24th of Koyak, after sunset, the effigy of Osiris in a coffin of mulberry wood was laid in the grave. At the 9th hour of the night, the effigy which had been made and deposited the year before was removed and placed upon boughs and sycamore. Lastly, on the 30th day of Koyak, they repaired to the Holy Sepulchre, a subterranean chamber which appeared to have grown a clump of Persia trees. Entering the vault by the western door, they laid the coffin effigy of the dead god reverently on a bed of sand in the chamber. So they left him to his rest and departed from the sepulchre by the eastern door. Thus ended the ceremonies in the month of Koyak. Part 5. The Resurrection of Osiris. The resurrection of Osiris represented on the monuments. In the foregoing account of the festival drawn from the great inscription of Dendera, the burial of Osiris figures prominently, while his resurrection is implied rather than expressed. This defect of the document, however, is amply compensated by a remarkable series of bas-reliefs which accompany and illustrate the inscription. These exhibit in a series of scenes the dead god lying swathed as a mummy on his bier, then gradually raising himself up higher and higher, until at last he has entirely quitted the bier and is seen erect between the guardian wings of the faithful Isis, who stands behind him while a male figure holds up before his eyes the crux and satar, the Egyptian symbol of life. The resurrection of the god could hardly be portrayed more graphically. Even more instructive, however, is another representation of the same event in a chamber depicted to Osiris in the great temple of Isis at Philae. Here we see the dead body of Osiris as stalks of corn springing from it, while the priest waters the stalks from a pitcher which he holds in his hand. The accompanying inscription sets forth that this is the form of him whom one may not name, Osiris of the mysteries, who springs from the turning waters. Taken together, the picture and the words seem to leave no doubt that Osiris was here conceived and represented as a personification of the corn which springs from the fields after they have been fertilized by the inundation. This, according to the inscription, was a kernel of the mysteries, the innermost secret revealed to the initiated. So in the rites of Demeter at Eleusis, a reaped ear of corn was exhibited to the worshippers as the central mystery of their religion. We can now fully understand why, at the great festival sowing in the month of Koyak, the priests used to bury effigies of Osiris made of earth and corn. When these effigies were taken up again at the end of the year of a shorter interval, the corn would be found to have sprouted from the body of Osiris, and the sprouting of the grain would be hailed as an omen, or rather as a cause of the growth of the crops. The corn god produced the corn from himself. He gave his own body to feed the people. He died that they might live. Corn-stuffed effigies of Osiris buried with the dead to ensure their resurrection. And from the death and resurrection of their great god, the Egyptians drew not only their support and sustenance in this life, but also their hope of a life eternal beyond the grave. This hope is indicated in the clearest manner by the very remarkable effigies of Osiris which have come to light in Egyptian cemeteries. Thus, in the Valley of the Kings at Thebes, there was found the tomb of a royal fan-bearer who lived about 1500 BC. Among the rich contents of the tomb, there was a bier on which rested a mattress of reeds covered with 3 layers of linen. On the upper side of the linen was painted a life-size figure of Osiris, and the interior of the figure, which was waterproof, contained a mixture of vegetable mold, barley, and a sticky fluid. The barley had sprouted and sent out shoots 2 or 3 inches long. Again, in the ceremony of Xenopolis were numerous burials of Osiris figures. These were made of grain wrapped up in cloth and roughly shaped like an Osiris, and placed inside a bricked-up recess at the sides of the tomb. Sometimes they're small pottery coffins, sometimes they're wooden coffins in the form of a hawk mummy, sometimes without any coffins at all. These corn-stuffed figures were bandaged like mummies, with patches of gilding here and there, as if in imitation of the golden mould in which the similar figures of Osiris were cast at the festival of sowing. Again, effigies of Osiris, with faces of green wax and their interior full of grain, were found buried near the necropolis of Thebes. Finally, we are told by Professor Erman that between the legs of mummies, there sometimes lies a figure of Osiris made of slime. It is filled with grains of corn, the sprouting of which is intended to signify the resurrection of the god. We cannot doubt that, just as the burial of corn-stuffed images of Osiris in the earth at the festival of sowing was designed to quicken the seed, so the burial of similar images in the grave was meant to quicken the dead. In other words, to ensure their spiritual immortality. Part 6. Readjustment of Egyptian festivals. The festivals of Osiris in the months of Aether and Koyak seem to have been substantially the same. The festival of Osiris, with Plutarch assigns to the month of Aether, would seem to be identical in substance with the one which the inscription of Dendera assigns to the following month, namely, to Koyak. Apparently the essence of both festivals was a dramatic representation of the death and resurrection of the god. In both of them, Isis was figured by a gilt cow and Osiris by an image moulded of moist vegetable earth. But if the festivals were the same, why were they held in different months? It is easy to suggest that different towns in Egypt celebrated the festival at different times, but we remember that according to the great inscription of Dendera, the authority of which is indisputable, the festival fell in the month of Koyak in every province of Egypt. We shall be reluctant to suppose that at some one place or even in a few places it was exceptionally held in the preceding month of Aether. And that the usually well-informed Plutarch described the exception as if it had been the rule, of which on this supposition he must have been wholly ignorant. More probably, the discrepancy is to be explained by the great change which came over the Egyptian calendar between the date of the inscription and the lifetime of Plutarch. For when the inscription was drawn up in the Ptolemaic age, the festivals were dated by the old vague or movable year, and therefore rotated gradually through the whole circle of the seasons, whereas at the same time when Plutarch wrote, about the end of the 1st century, they were seemingly dated by the fixed Alexandrian year and accordingly had ceased to rotate. The old festival of Koyak may have been transferred to Aether when the Egyptians adopted the fixed Alexandrian year in 30 BC. But even if we grant that in Plutarch's day the festivals had become stationary, still this would not explain why the old festival of Koyak had been transferred to Aether. In order to understand that transference, it seems necessary to suppose that when the Egyptians gave to their months fixed places in the solar year by accepting the Alexandrian system of intercalation, they at the same time transferred the festivals from what may be called their artificial to their natural dates. Under the old system, a summer festival was sometimes held in winter, and a winter festival in summer. A harvest celebration sometimes fell at the season of sowing, and a sowing celebration at the season of harvest. People might reconcile themselves to such anomalies so long as they knew that they were only temporary, and that in the course of time the festivals would necessarily return to their proper seasons. But it must have been otherwise when they adopted a fixed instead of a movable year, and so arrested the rotation of the festivals forever. For they could not but be aware that every festival would thenceforth continue to occupy for all time that particular place in the solar year which it chanced to occupy in the year 30 BC, when the calendar became fixed. And in that particular year it happened, as it might have happened, that the summer festivals were held in winter, and the winter festivals in summer. They would always be so held in future. The absurdity and anomaly would never again be rectified as it had been before. This consideration, which could not have escaped intelligent men, may have suggested the advisability of transferring the festivals from the dates at which they chanced to be celebrated in 30 BC to the dates at which they ought properly to be celebrated in the course of nature. The transference would be intelligible if we suppose that in 30 BC the dates of all of the Egyptian festivals were shifted backward by about a month in order to restore them to their natural places in the calendar. Now, what in the year 30 BC was the actual amount of discrepancy between the accidental and the natural dates of the festivals? It was little more than a month. In that year Thoth, the first month of the Egyptian calendar happened to begin on the 29th of August, whereas according to theory it should have begun with the heliacal rising of Osiris on the 20th of July. That is, 40 days, or roughly speaking, a month earlier. From this it follows that in the year 30 BC, all the Egyptian festivals fell about a month later than their natural dates, and they must have continued to fall a month late forever if they were allowed to retain those places in the calendar which they chanced to occupy in that particular year. In these circumstances, it would be a natural and sensible thing to restore the festivals to their proper places in the solar year by celebrating them one calendar month earlier than before. If this measure were adopted, the festivals which had hitherto been held, for example, in the third month Athir, would henceforth be held in the second month Phaophir. The festivals which had hitherto fallen in the fourth month Koyak would thenceforth fall in the third month Athir, and so on. Thus the festival calendar would be reduced to harmony with the seasons instead of being in more or less flagrant discord with them, as it had generally been before, and must always have been afterwards in the charge which I have indicated had not been introduced. It is only to credit the native astronomers and the Roman rulers of Egypt with common sense to suppose that they actually adopted the measure. On that supposition, we can perfectly understand why the festival of sowing, which had formerly belonged to the month of Koyak, was transferred to Athir. For in the Alexandrian calendar, Koyak corresponds very nearly to December and Athir to November. But in Egypt, the month of November, not the month of December, is the season of sowing. There was therefore every reason why the great sowing festival of the corn god Osiris should be held in Athir and not Koyak, in November and not in December. In like manner, we may suppose that all the Egyptian festivals were restored to their true places in the solar year, and that when Plutarch dates a festival both by its calendar month and by its relation to the cycle of seasons, he is perfectly right in doing so, and we may accept his evidence with confidence instead of having to accuse him of ignorantly confounding the movable Egyptian with a fixed Alexandrian year. Accusations of ignorance levelled at the best writers of antiquity are apt to recoil on those who make them. End of section 5.